The admissions manager didn't even look up from his desk when Imani Bellrose doubled over and grabbed at the edge of the counter. She was 32 years old, 9 months pregnant, and her contractions were coming 3 minutes apart. She had driven herself to Wycliffe Crown Medical Center because the pain had started too fast and too hard of her to think straight. Her maternity bag was on her shoulder. Her water hadn't broken yet, but she knew the way a woman carrying her first child just knows that something was wrong with her baby's position. Her doctor had warned her about it at the last appointment. Transverse presentation. High risk. Come in immediately if labor starts. She came in immediately, and the man behind the counter told her she wasn't in the system. "I have insurance," Imani said. Her voice was steady. She was good at steady. She'd trained herself to be steady in rooms where black women who raised their voices were labeled difficult, and black women who showed fear were dismissed. Blue Meridian Premier. Policy number 4000, 471 BM 2209. "I've had this policy for 6 years. The manager badge said Hargrove. Patient Services typed something. Looked at his screen. Typed again. "Ms. Bellrose, your policy was suspended 48 hours ago due to non-payment." "That's not possible. I'm showing a lapse in coverage, effective February 9th. "I have autopay. I have had autopay since I opened that account." Hargrove folded his hands on the desk, like a man who had long since stopped caring whether the people in front of him believed him. "I understand your frustration. Without confirmed active coverage, we'd need a deposit of..." Another contraction hit. Imani pressed one hand flat on the counter and breathed through it the way her birthing class had taught her. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. She wasn't afraid of pain. She was afraid of what the pain meant about where her daughter currently was inside her body. $42,000 to initiate admission for a C-section candidate. Imani looked up. "I work on Wall Street," she said very quietly. "I know exactly what this is. You are denying emergency care to a woman in active labor because of a paperwork error that your department could verify and override in under 10 minutes. It's not a paperwork error, Ms. Bellrose. The suspension was processed by your insurer. Then call them. Call them right now, or I will stand at this desk and deliver my daughter on your lobby floor, and the footage will be on every news network in Seattle by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." Hargrove looked at her for the first time. Really looked at her. Then he looked past her, at the 2 security guards, standing near the entrance, and he made a small gesture with his chin. Not toward a phone, toward the door they escorted her outside. The February air hit her like a wall. Seattle's in winter didn't do dramatic cold. It did wet, gray, bone-deep cold that worked its way through your coat before you realized it. The rain was fine and freezing, the kind that collected on your eyelashes and the back of your neck. Imani stood under the hospital canopy with her maternity bag at her feet and her phone open and her hands shaking, not from fear, not yet, from the effort of not falling apart in the 15 seconds she had before the next contraction. She called a rideshare. The first driver accepted and then canceled. The second one saw her standing outside a hospital, clearly in labor, and drove past without stopping. She stood on the sidewalk outside the most expensive private medical facility in the Pacific Northwest, and she was completely alone. This is the moment she would return to for years afterward, not as a memory of helplessness, but as the precise moment she understood what helplessness felt like from the inside, so she would never mistake it for something else again. Then a black sedan pulled to the curb. The man who stepped out was tall, Korean, wearing a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than her monthly rent. He moved with the particular stillness of someone who never rushed because he didn't need rooms cleared for him before he reached them. He looked at the hospital entrance. Then he looked at her. And he went very still in a different way. Imani. She hadn't heard that voice in 3 years. Kang Tae-jun looked older than she remembered, which was strange, because she'd spent 3 years constructing an image of him in her head that was already becoming a photograph, flat, fixed, slightly unreal. The actual man standing in front of her was sharper. The lines around his eyes were deeper. He looked like someone who hadn't been sleeping well. She looked like she was about to go into emergency surgery. "Don't," she said. "You're in labor. Don't talk to me." Imani. He said it differently the second time, not commanding, not pleading, just acknowledging. Like he understood that she had every right to tell him to go to hell and was choosing to stay anyway. What's happening? Another contraction. She couldn't hide it. She bent forward, one hand on her knees, and breathed through it, and when she straightened up, her vision had gone slightly white at the edges. "They won't admit me," she said, because there wasn't time for anything else. "My insurance was suspended. I don't know why. The baby is transverse, and I've been in labor for 2 hours, and they put me outside." Tae-jun looked at the hospital entrance. Something moved behind his eyes, something that wasn't surprise. He picked up her bag. "Come. I am not going anywhere with... Our history can wait." His voice was flat, not unkind. "Just certain. Your daughter cannot." She would hate herself later for how quickly she followed him. Not because it was weak, but because she recognized, in the part of her mind that was still analytical even through labor pain, that she had no better option. A sound like green wood splitting, and recognizing that she had no better option and following him anyway felt like losing something, some piece of the 3 years she had spent proving to herself that she didn't need him for anything. Inside, things moved differently. Tae-jun didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten anyone. He walked to Hargrove's desk, said something quiet and specific that Imani couldn't hear over the sound of her own blood in her ears, and handed the man a card. Not a credit card, something else. Hargrove looked at it, picked up his phone, made a call that lasted 40 seconds. Put the phone down. His voice had changed completely. "We'll get you admitted right away. I apologize for the delay." Delay. Imani looked at Tae-jun. He met her eyes and said nothing. They took her to a room. A doctor she hadn't seen before introduced herself as Dr. Park, chief of maternal fetal medicine, and said she'd be overseeing Imani's care personally. The fetal monitors went on. The baby's heartbeat filled the room fast, strong, irregular, in a way that made Dr. Park's expression do something careful and controlled. Tae-jun stayed in the hallway. For the next several hours, Imani was too focused on not dying and not letting her daughter die to think about anything else. The contractions intensified. The baby's position didn't correct. They tried 2 manual techniques and both failed. Dr. Park came in, sat down, and had the kind of calm, direct conversation that doctors have when they're telling you that the situation has moved past the option you were hoping for. Emergency C-section. Imani signed the consent forms. Her hand was steady. She called her mother. Got voicemail. Left a message that said, "Mom, I'm at Wycliffe Crown. Everything is going to be fine. Call me when you get this." She kept her voice level the entire time because the alternative was losing it entirely, and she needed to not do that right now. She didn't call anyone else. There wasn't anyone else. The surgery took 47 minutes. Imani was awake for it. Spinal block, drape across her chest, the strange painless pressure of hands working inside her body that she couldn't see. She stared at the ceiling lights and thought about the balance sheet she had been working on before her water broke, because her brain needed something concrete to grip. Then the drape shifted, and there was the sound of suction and movement, and a doctor saying, okay, here she comes." Silence. Not the brief silence of a newborn catching its breath. Real silence. 40 seconds of it. Imani counted. She counted because if she stopped counting, she was going to start screaming, and the scream was going to be the kind that didn't stop, so she counted instead. 1, 2, 3. She stared at the ceiling. 4, 5. The room was not quiet. People were moving. A machine was beeping. Someone said something she couldn't make out. 6, 7, 8. She pressed her hands flat against the table on either side of her because she needed something to push against. 9, 10. The baby screamed. Not a weak sound. A furious, outraged, full-lunged scream that filled the OR like a statement of intent. Imani stopped counting. She wasn't crying. She told herself she wasn't crying. Warm liquid was running down the sides of her face, but that was a physical reaction, not an emotion. She was in control. They placed the baby against her cheek. Small, wrinkled, outraged at the world she'd just arrived in. Imani stopped controlling anything. They named her later. Not then. Then she just held her, and the baby screamed and then stopped screaming and just breathed against Imani's skin. And Imani stared at the top of her daughter's head and understood for the first time in her life that there was a category of feeling that was bigger than language. From the doorway of the recovery room, Tae-jun stood watching. He hadn't been invited. He hadn't been asked to leave. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and watched the baby be placed into Imani's arms, and something moved across his face that he couldn't control, a brief, unguarded thing. Not sentiment, something rawer than that. Like a man looking at something he hadn't expected to want and finding that he wanted it very badly. He didn't come in. Imani didn't look at the door, but she knew he was there. At 2 in the morning, the room was quiet. The baby slept in the clear plastic bassinet beside her, bundled in the hospital's white and pink striped blanket. Face slack, with the absolute unconscious trust of someone who had known the world for less than 12 hours and had already decided it was fine. Tae-jun knocked on the open door. Imani looked at him, then at the bassinet, then back at him. "You can come in," she said. "But you don't get to think that this means anything." He came in, stopped several feet away, looked at the baby with an expression she couldn't fully decode. "She's beautiful," he said. "I know," a beat Tae-jun. She kept her voice flat. "How did you get my insurance reinstated?" He didn't answer immediately. That was an answer in itself. "How did you get to that hospital tonight?" she pressed. "I've been in Seattle for 3 years. You don't live here." "You never lived here. So why were you outside at 11 o'clock on a February night?" He looked at the window. "The insurance wasn't a system error," he said. Her stomach went cold. "What does that mean?" "Someone filed a suspension request. Directly with Blue Meridian. The paperwork was clean. It looked like a standard administrative closure. But the account it was filed from belonged to a third-party legal firm." "Which firm?" He turned and looked at her directly. "Wycliffe Corporate Counsel." The name hit her like a hand closing around her throat. Wycliffe. She was lying in a room in Wycliffe Crown Medical Center. Sterling Wycliffe's hospital. Sterling Wycliffe, who had never met her, whose name she had known for years only as the signature on the building's donor wall in the lobby. "Sterling Wycliffe had my insurance canceled," she said. Not a question. An attempt to make the reality stay still long enough to examine it. "Yes. Why would Sterling Wycliffe know who I am?" Tae-jun was quiet for long enough that she understood this wasn't a question he'd been hoping she'd ask tonight. "Or maybe ever. Tae-jun, because he knows who your father was." The baby made a small sound in her sleep, a tiny reflexive grunt, the kind newborns make when they're dreaming something too new to be called a dream. Imani didn't look at her. She kept her eyes on Tae-jun's face. "My father died when I was 7, she said. The silence that followed was the worst kind, the kind that tells you, before a single word is spoken, that you have been living inside a story someone else wrote for you. And the person in front of you has known the real version for longer than you can stand to calculate." Imani. His voice was different, not careful. Careful would have been easier. He sounded like someone who had practiced this moment and found that practice hadn't helped. "Your father's name was Augustus Wycliffe." She looked at him. "Augustus Wycliffe," he said again, "founder of Wycliffe Crown Holdings. Sterling's father. He died 14 months ago, and before he died, he wrote a will." The rain outside hit the window in a gust. The baby slept. In that will, Tae-jun continued, he left 42% of Wycliffe Crown Holdings to his biological daughter. He held her gaze and didn't look away. "To you." The room felt like it had shifted 2 degrees off its axis. Imani Bellrose, analyst, single mother woman who had stood outside this building and later someone canceled her insurance, was the heir to nearly half of the medical empire that had just tried to leave her outside in the freezing rain. And the man standing in her hospital room at 2 in the morning had known. He had known, she understood now, for longer than she could immediately calculate. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the way he was holding his body, not closed off, but braced. Like someone standing in front of a wave they've been watching for years and have no illusion of stopping. "How long?" she said. He didn't pretend not to understand the question. "Since before we met," he said. The baby breathed. The rain hit the glass. Imani Bellrose looked at the man she had loved and lost and spent 3 years erasing from her nervous system, and understood that the story she was living in was considerably larger and older and more tangled than anything she had been allowed to see. She looked at her daughter. Then she looked back at him. "You're going to tell me everything," she said. It wasn't a request. Tae-jun didn't argue. "Yes," he said. "I am." And the night outside was just beginning to shift toward gray when the real story, the one that had been waiting for her before she was old enough to look for it, finally started to get told. He talked until 4 in the morning. Imani didn't interrupt. That was the thing that would surprise her later, how completely she went quiet. She who had made a professional career out of asking the right question at exactly the right moment, who had sat across negotiating tables from men twice her age and twice her net worth and never once let silence work. Yet she went absolutely still and let Tae-jun talk, because some part of her understood that if she opened her mouth before he finished, she would say something she couldn't take back. The baby slept through all of it. Tae-jun stood near the window the entire time. He didn't sit. He didn't pace. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and spoke in the particular, flat, economical way of someone who has organized a confession over a long period of time and is now simply delivering it, not performing remorse, not asking for anything, just transferring information because it belongs to the person in front of him, and always did. Augustus Wycliffe, he said, had 2 families. The official one, Sterling, his mother Eleanor, the Wycliffe name and its 40-year accumulation of hospitals, real estate, and carefully managed public image. And the unofficial one, which was just a woman named Imani Bellrose, and the daughter Diane carried alone after Augustus's family found out and made the choice for him. He was 43, Tae-jun said. Your mother was 28. They were together for 2 years before his family intervened. His mother and Sterling's mother, Eleanor, they weren't in the same generation, but they understood each other on this particular point. That he couldn't be with a black woman. That he couldn't be with a black woman who had no dynasty behind her and every reason to complicate theirs. He said it without flinching. Augustus didn't fight them. He told himself it was protection. That walking away was cleaner than what the alternative would cost Diane. He sent money for a while. Your mother refused it after the first year. Imani already knew that part. Her mother had told her once, when Imani was 19, and asking questions that daughters ask when they're old enough to need real answers. Diane had said, he sent checks. I sent them back. We don't take what someone's ashamed to give openly. She had never told Imani who the man was. He watched, Tae-jun continued. From a distance. He had people, not investigators. Nothing that clinical. Just someone who would tell him occasionally how you were doing. What school, what grades. When you got into Columbia. He knew I went to Columbia. He was in New York the weekend of your graduation. The room contracted. Imani felt it, a physical sensation, like the walls had moved an inch inward. She looked at the bassinet. The baby's chest rose and fell. He didn't come to find me, she said. No, he was in the same city and he didn't. No, Tae-jun's voice didn't soften it. He didn't. She absorbed that. She filed it somewhere carefully because she couldn't feel the full weight of it. Yet she was 24 hours out of surgery, and her daughter was 11 hours old, and there was a limit to how much reality a body could process at once. When did you come into this? She said. 5 years ago. Augustus was already sick. By then he'd been diagnosed 18 months earlier, non-Hodgkin's, and he knew the timeline. The Wycliffe Empire had intersected with my organization several times over the years. Real estate, private financing. Augustus knew what I was. A beat. He knew who I was, and he came to you. He came to me. He said he needed someone Sterling couldn't touch. Someone who could find you, and Tae-jun stopped. Started again. He didn't trust his own people. Sterling had been running the operational side of the business for years by that point. Augustus was afraid that if he approached you directly, Sterling would find out and move against you before Augustus could structure the legal protections. So he hired the Mafia to babysit me. The word landed between them and stayed there. Tae-jun didn't correct her. I agreed to find you. To confirm you were safe, to report back. One time. That was the arrangement. Imani looked at him. But you kept going back. The silence was its own answer. How long before you introduced yourself to me? 8 months. 8 months of watching me, yes. And when you introduced yourself, it wasn't accidental. He said it before she could ask, because he clearly understood that letting her ask it would be worse. The gallery opening. The contact through your colleague. That was arranged. She thought about the gallery opening. She had been 37 days into a new job, exhausted and slightly lost in a city where she didn't yet know enough people. And a colleague had mentioned an event, and she'd gone mostly because she needed to do something that wasn't her apartment. She remembered thinking Tae-jun had approached her because of the painting she'd been standing in front of a Basquiat print, the kind of piece that invites commentary. She'd thought it was organic. She'd built the entire memory around that assumption. You knew what painting I'd stop at, she said. I knew which artist you followed. She breathed in, breathed out. I need you to stop talking for 1 minute, she said. He stopped. The minute passed. The baby made the small grunting sound again. Imani watched the rise and fall of that tiny chest and used it the way she'd used the counting in the OR, something real, something physical, something that required no interpretation. Then she said, Did you love me, or were you managing me? Tae-jun looked at her. His jaw tightened. I need you to understand that those aren't mutually exclusive for me to ask, she said. 'Cause from where I'm standing, a man was paid to find me, and instead of telling me any part of the truth, he constructed a version of himself that I could fall in love with. So I need to know which part of the 2 years we were together was real, and which part was your employer's instructions. Augustus never instructed me to have a relationship with you. That's not what I asked. I loved you. His voice came out rougher than he intended. She could hear it, the place where the control slipped, just briefly, just enough. I love you. But I understand completely if that doesn't mean anything to you right now. It doesn't, she said. He nodded. He'd expected that. Or he'd prepared for it, which wasn't the same thing, but looked identical from the outside. Keep going, she said. Tell me the rest. Augustus died 14 months ago. His lawyers filed the will the following week. 42% of Wycliffe Crown holdings to Imani Bellrose, biological daughter, with accompanying DNA verification and a full legal brief establishing the chain of evidence for her parentage. Sterling found out before the ink was dry. He challenged it immediately, Tae-jun said. Undue influence. Claimed Augustus had been in cognitive decline. The legal battle has been running for over a year. I've had no contact from anyone at Wycliffe. No lawyers, no... Sterling's strategy wasn't to beat you in court. Not primarily. It was to isolate you first. Make sure you didn't have resources or support or information before the challenge was ever formally served. He paused. The insurance cancellation was the third move, not the first. Imani went very still. What were the first two? Tae-jun reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a single folded sheet of paper. He set it on the bed, beside her, not in her hands, but beside her, because he was being careful about the exact boundary between giving her information and managing her, and she noticed that, and it registered as something. She picked it up. It was a summary. 2 paragraphs. The first described a professional reference that had been quietly undermined 18 months ago, a senior contact at a Chicago investment firm who had agreed to vouch for Imani's application to a portfolio management position she had ultimately not received. The contact had later told a mutual colleague he'd been approached with information suggesting Imani was a litigation risk. The second paragraph described a credit inquiry that had opened 6 small fraudulent accounts in Imani's name 14 months ago, accounts that had been quietly closed before they could affect her score, but which had generated enough internal flag activity to delay her mortgage application by 4 months. He's been working through proxies, Tae-jun said. Nothing traceable directly to Sterling, all of it deniable. The insurance cancellation was the first move he made that left a clean paper trail because he did it fast and he was angry, and he didn't bother covering it as carefully. Why now? Why the insurance? Why this week? Because Conrad Ellery filed a motion 3 weeks ago to formalize service of the inheritance claim. Sterling's challenge has been running on delay tactics, but Conrad found a procedural lever and used it. The court set a hearing date for next month. Sterling is out of time to exhaust you quietly. Conrad Ellery. She didn't know that name yet. She filed it. Who is Conrad Ellery? Augustus's estate attorney. The man who drafted the will. He's been managing your end of the legal case without your knowledge, because he couldn't risk Sterling intercepting contact with you before the formal service was filed. He's been managing my legal case, Imani said, without my knowledge. Yes. Just like you were managing my safety without my knowledge. Yes. And Augustus was managing my entire existence without my knowledge. Imani, I'm not asking you to defend it. Her voice was sharp and flat at the same time, like a blade that's been honed past the point of drama into pure function. I'm cataloging it. I want to understand the full architecture of decisions that were made about my life by people who apparently had strong opinions about what I could handle. Tae-jun didn't answer. There was nothing to say to that which wouldn't make it worse. Why did you disappear 3 years ago? She said. The real reason. Another long pause. Sterling found out about us. There it was. He found out about us, Imani repeated. And he couldn't move directly against me. The Baekryong Syndicate's relationship with Sterling's world is complicated. He doesn't have the leverage to threaten me directly. Tae-jun's voice was careful, clinical, the way it got when he was discussing something that cost him to discuss. So he threatened you. He told me that if I stayed in your life, he would expose my criminal investigators and name you as a knowing associate. He said he would bury you in investigations, destroy your career, make you toxic to every firm and every contact you had, and use you as leverage in a war that would eventually leave you with nothing. The room was quiet except for the rain, and you believed him. He had the capacity to do exactly what he described. I've seen what Sterling does when he's cornered. He doesn't bluff. So you left. Yes, you decided, she said slowly, that the appropriate response to a man threatening to destroy my life was to remove yourself from my life. Without telling me. Without asking me. She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. You made a decision about what I could survive. You looked at the situation and you decided, without consulting me, that I would be better off if you vanished. That I was better protected, not knowing anything. Yes, he said, you decided my life for me. The words fell between them like something solid. Yes, he said again. He didn't try to frame it differently. He didn't add context. He just let it sit there, acknowledged and undefended. Imani looked at her daughter. Get out, she said. He picked up his coat. I'll be outside, he said. Not in the hallway. I'll be in the building. If you need anything. I know where to find you if I need something. Her voice was even. That's different from wanting you there. He left. She didn't sleep. She lay in the hospital bed with her daughter, in the bassinet 3 feet away, and she stared at the ceiling and she let the full weight of it arrive in pieces, because that was the only way to handle something this size in pieces. Each one separately, each one held up and examined before you set it down and reached for the next. Her father had been alive. For 32 years, she had carried a story about a man who died young, a man her mother had loved briefly and lost young, a man who existed only in the single photograph Diane kept in the hallway closet and never displayed but never threw away. A man who was myth and absence and a faint genetic echo in Imani's own face when the light was right. He had been alive. He had been 40 minutes away when she crossed the stage at Columbia. He had been watching from a distance for decades, apparently convinced that distance was the same as protection, that staying away was the same as keeping her safe. Augustus Wycliffe, founder of the medical empire that had just tried to leave her outside in the rain. Her half-brother was Sterling Wycliffe. Her father had left her 42% of everything. And the man she had spent 2 years loving and 3 years mourning the loss of had known all of it before he ever said hello to her. She thought about the gallery opening. She thought about the Basquiat print and the conversation that had felt so accidentally perfect, so precisely the kind of meeting that you construct in memory into a story about coincidence and timing and the universe deciding something. A sound like green wood splitting. She thought about the first time Tae-jun had said her name and how it had sounded different than it did in anyone else's mouth, like he was already comfortable with it, already familiar, in a way she'd read as intensity. She understood now what it actually was. At 7 in the morning, a man knocked on the door who was not Tae-jun. He was short, white, mid-60s, in an expensive suit that fit the way expensive suits fit when they've been made for a specific body over many years. He carried a leather briefcase. He had the measured movements of a man accustomed to delivering difficult information to people who had not asked for it. Ms. Bellrose. I'm Conrad Ellery. I represent the estate of Augustus Wycliffe. He paused in the doorway. I've been waiting to make contact with you for over a year. I apologize that this is how it's happening. Imani looked at him. Come in, she said, and closed the door. Conrad Ellery came in and closed the door and sat in the chair beside her bed without being invited to Whitney, the way people who have been waiting a long time for a conversation to move with urgency that they're trying to dress up as composure. He set the briefcase on his knees. He didn't open it yet. I need to know who else you've spoken to, he said. Tae-jun Kang. Conrad's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. How much did he tell you? Enough, you verify it. Your father, Augustus Wycliffe, she corrected. The word father wasn't something she was prepared to deploy, yet in conversation with a stranger. Augustus Wycliffe, Conrad said, and she gave him credit for not pushing. He approached me 7 years ago about structuring the inheritance. We worked for 4 years to ensure the documentation was airtight. DNA testing, independent verification of his mental competency, full provenance on every piece of the estate that was to be allocated to you. He opened the briefcase. The will is legitimate. Your parentage is documented. The inheritance is real. He produced a folder and held it out. She took it. She didn't open it. Sterling's challenge, she said, is failing. Slowly but failing. Conrad leaned forward slightly. The cognitive incapacity argument requires expert testimony, and the evaluations from Augustus's physicians are comprehensive. But Sterling has resources and patience, and he's been using every procedural delay available. The hearing next month will be the first real test. He paused. That's why Sterling moved on your insurance when he did. He wanted you destabilized before you had formal legal representation. I need a lawyer. I am your lawyer, Ms. Bellrose. If you'll accept the representation. She looked at him. You were hired by Augustus. Your loyalty is to a dead man. My loyalty, Conrad said carefully, is to the execution of his wishes. And his wish, very specifically, was that you receive what is legally yours, and that you have competent representation when Sterling came for it. He held her gaze. He was afraid Sterling would come for it. He planned for it. He just paused. He ran out of time to tell you himself. Imani opened the folder. The first document was the DNA report. She was Augustus Wycliffe's biological daughter with 99.97% certainty. She had known it was coming. Seeing it printed on formal letterhead still did something to her stomach. The second document was the will. She read it carefully. She was not a lawyer, but she was an investment analyst, and she understood the architecture of complex financial documents, and she read it with the same precision she would bring to a fund prospectus, tracking the percentages and the conditions and the exact language used at each juncture. 42% of Wycliffe Crown Holdings. She looked up from the page. This is worth approximately $800 million at current valuation, Conrad said, subject to market fluctuation and the outcomes of several pending projects. The baby made a sound. Imani looked at her daughter, who had woken up and was making the small, urgent sounds that meant hunger, the sounds that were 11 hours old and already completely familiar. She reached over and lifted her daughter out of the bassinet, one-handed, carefully, aware of the pull across her abdomen where the incision was. She settled the baby against her chest. $800 million. And someone had tried to leave them both outside in the rain. Sterling Wycliffe walked into her room at 11 o'clock that same morning, and Imani understood immediately that he had not come to negotiate. He was taller than she'd expected, which was irrational. She knew nothing about him physically. He was in his mid-50s, silver-haired, wearing a suit that cost approximately what Imani made in a month at her old job. He walked in the way men walk into rooms they own, which in Sterling's case was technically accurate. He looked at the baby first, then at Imani. He smiled. It was a particular kind of smile, the one that lives entirely above the lip line and never reaches the eyes, the one that powerful men deploy in rooms where they expect to win. Ms. Bellrose. His voice was smooth, British educated, the vowels slightly lengthened. I understand congratulations are in order. You canceled my insurance, she said. The smile stayed. I'm not sure what you. Your corporate counsel's office filed the suspension request 48 hours ago. I have the account number. She didn't yet, but he didn't know that. Sit down or leave, Sterling. I just had surgery, and I don't have the patience for your version of small talk. Something moved behind his eyes. The smile adjusted, not disappearing, but recalibrating, shifting from I'm going to enjoy this to this is going to be more work than I expected. He sat. You're in a difficult position, he said. I understand that. An unexpected inheritance claim is disorienting, and you've been kept in the dark about much of this situation through no fault of your own. He folded his hands in his lap. Relaxed. The posture of a man who believes time is on his side. I'm here to offer you a cleaner exit than what the courts will eventually provide. A buyout. A settlement. Generous. Structured to give you immediate liquidity without the years of litigation that. How much? He named a number. It was large. It was also, she calculated in the 3 seconds after he said it, approximately 8% of what the inheritance was actually worth. You want me to take 8 cents on the dollar, she said. I want to avoid a protracted legal battle that benefits no one except the attorneys. It benefits me, she said. If I win, he said. Just that. The baby shifted against her chest. Imani adjusted her hold and looked at Sterling Wycliffe, her half-brother. She reminded herself, which was a sentence she was going to need considerable more time to even begin to process, and she thought about Tae-jun standing in the hallway outside this room, who was there because Augustus had sent him, who had loved her or performed love or some combination of the two that she still couldn't fully untangle, who had made decisions about her life for 3 years without her consent. And she thought, every man in this situation has decided, at some point, what Imani Bellrose could handle. No, she said. Sterling's posture didn't change. Think carefully, he said. I have, she said. The answer is no. You'll hear from Conrad Ellery. A beat. Sterling looked at the baby, then back at Imani. The smile was entirely gone now. What was underneath it was something colder and less managed, not rage. Sterling Wycliffe didn't do rage, but something adjacent to it. Something that had learned to wear patience as a mask for a very long time. Tae-jun Kang has hidden considerably more from you than you realize, he said. It was designed to destabilize her, to make her feel like the floor had shifted. She recognized the technique because she had seen it used across negotiating tables, and she had used it herself. She turned and looked directly at the door. Tae-jun was in the hallway. She couldn't see him, but she knew he was there. She turned back to Sterling. I know, she said. He's going to tell me the rest of it today. Sterling stood, buttoned his jacket. The performance of composure reasserted itself with impressive speed. My offer expires in 72 hours. It expired when you sat down, she said. He left. Imani sat with her daughter in the quiet room, the folder still open on the bed beside her, and she made the decision that would define the next year of her life in the 10 seconds after the door clicked shut. She was not going to let any of them, not Sterling, not Tae-jun, not Conrad Ellery, not the ghost of Augustus Wycliffe, continue to move her like a piece on a board that she hadn't been invited to sit at. She called out toward the hallway. Tae-jun. He appeared in the doorway. No more secrets, she said. Starting now. Everything you haven't told me yet. All of it. She looked at him steadily. And if there is one single thing I find out later that you chose to hold back today, we are done. Not as anything romantic as anything. No alliance, no cooperation, nothing. Am I clear? He stepped into the room. Yes, he said. Then close the door and sit down. He did. And the Mafia Boss, who had built 30 years of power on the principle that information was the most dangerous thing you could give another person, sat down across from the woman he loved and began, for the first time in his life, to give all of it away. Tae-jun talked for 2 hours. Imani didn't move from the bed. She held Amara. She had decided on the name sometime in the gray hour before Conrad arrived. And the decision had felt less like choosing and more like recognizing something that was already true. And she listened with the same quality of attention she brought earnings calls and due diligence reviews, the kind that doesn't just track what is being said but maps the architecture underneath it, the load-bearing walls, the the places where the structure is sound, and the places where it has been quietly patched. The Baekryong Syndicate had started as a logistics operation in the early 90s. Korean-American, built on the bones of legitimate freight and warehouse businesses that Tae-jun's father had established in Los Angeles. When Tae-jun took over at 29, his father had died of a stroke, sudden no succession plan, the kind of vacuum that either collapses an organization or hardens it. He had expanded into private financings, real estate holding companies, and hospitality. The criminal infrastructure was real, but it ran beneath a surface that was, in most of its visible dimensions, entirely legal. "How many people work for you?" Imani said. "In the legitimate businesses, roughly 400. In the other operations," he paused. "Fewer, and fewer every year for the last 5. You've been winding it down." "I've been trying." He said it without drama. "It takes longer than you'd think. You can't simply close a criminal organization the way you close a restaurant. There are relationships, obligations, people whose livelihoods depend on structures you built. People who would hurt you if you moved too fast." Yes, she absorbed that. "Tell me what Sterling knows about the syndicate." "Enough. Not everything. He has contacts in federal law enforcement, legitimate ones. He sits on a hospital oversight board that intersects with a congressional committee. He knows the syndicate exists. He knows I run it. He has enough to make a referral that would trigger an investigation. And an investigation, even one that ultimately finds nothing prosecutable, would expose the legitimate businesses to scrutiny that could be damaging. But he hasn't done it, because doing it would expose his own connection to me. The Wycliffe Empire has used Baekryong's financing arms twice in the last decade. Both transactions were structured to be deniable from Sterling's personal position, but the paper trail exists, and if I went down in a federal investigation, the forensic accountants would find it. Mutually assured destruction. For as long as neither of us moves first. He looked at her steadily. That balance shifts if Sterling becomes desperate enough. If the inheritance case turns decisively against him, he might decide that burning both of us is preferable to losing. Imani looked at Amara. The baby was asleep again. Newborns slept in these short, fierce cycles, dropping into unconsciousness with the totality of someone who had not yet learned to fight at rest. Her face was slack and perfect, and completely unaware that the room around her was full of the kind of information that rearranged lives. "The evidence Conrad has," Imani said. "The will, the DNA, the competency records. Is it enough to beat Sterling's challenge?" Conrad believes so. "What do you believe?" Tae-jun was quiet for a moment. "I believe it's enough if Sterling fights clean. I don't believe Sterling will fight clean." "Then what does he do next?" "He produces a medical evaluation. He's been building toward it since the challenge was filed, finding physicians willing to testify that Augustus showed signs of cognitive decline in the years before he died. It's the strongest card he has left." Tae-jun shifted his weight slightly, and it's almost entirely fabricated. Augustus was sharp until the last 4 months. I was with him during several of the meetings where the will was discussed. He was precise, deliberate. He knew exactly what he was doing. "Can you prove that?" The answer came a half-second late. Just a half-second, but she caught it. "Yes," he said. How Augustus anticipated Sterling's challenge. He gave me a set of documents, independent medical evaluations, recorded conversations, correspondence with Conrad, personal letters. All of it dated and verified. All of it establishing that he was mentally competent when the will was executed. Imani looked at him. "You've had this for over a year." "Yes, and you didn't give it to Conrad." "No," she waited. "Using those materials," Tae-jun said, "requires me to disclose my direct relationship with Augustus. Which means disclosing the nature of our arrangement. Which means that a federal court receives documentation establishing that Kang Tae-jun had a personal financial and operational relationship with Augustus Wycliffe." He paused. "That opens the Baekryong Syndicate's legitimate businesses to the kind of scrutiny that could." "I understand the calculation," Imani said. "You've been holding evidence that could win my case because using it would cost you." "Yes." The word landed in the room and nobody moved. The baby breathed. The rain, which had paused for a few hours in the early morning, had started again lighter now, just a steady gray presence against the window that made the room feel sealed off from everything outside it. "Give it to Conrad," she said. "Imani, I'm not asking you to decide whether it's worth the risk. That's your decision." She looked at him with the directness she had developed over years in rooms full of people who expected her to be deferential. "I'm telling you that if you're going to take the risk, take it because you believe it's right. Not because you're trying to earn something back from me. Not as a trade. A pause, I won't be a transaction." Tae-jun looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat and produced his phone and made a call that lasted 45 seconds. When he hung up, he said, "Conrad will have everything within the hour." Imani nodded. "Now get out," she said. "I need to feed my daughter and sleep for 2 hours, and I want to do both of those things without an audience." He left without argument. She was starting to understand that when he didn't argue, it wasn't deference, it was a man recalibrating in real time, figuring out the difference between protecting someone and controlling them, and finding it harder than he'd expected. She slept 3 hours, not 2. Amara woke her, not an alarm. The room had the flat gray light of a Seattle afternoon, and Imani lay for a moment in the specific disorientation of wake somewhere unfamiliar, with a body that hurt and a mind that was already moving, already organizing, before she was fully conscious. She called her mother. Diane Bellrose answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been holding the phone. "Imani, baby, I got your message at 2 in the morning and I have been mine." "I'm fine, Mom." "She's fine. Her name is Amara." A sound on the other end of the line that wasn't quite a word. "Come to Seattle," Imani said. "I'll send you a ticket. I need you to come soon, because there are things I have to tell you that I can't tell you on the phone." Silence. "Is it about—" "Yes," Imani said. "It's about him. Come, Mom." On the third day, she told the hospital she would be discharging herself. Dr. Park argued, professionally and without heat, that 4 days was the standard recovery for a C-section, and Imani was technically 24 hours early. Imani thanked her for the care and asked for the paperwork. She understood the risk. She had a follow-up appointment scheduled. She needed to go home. Home was a 2-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill that she had chosen because it had good light, and a second room she had spent the last 3 months preparing for a baby she had planned to raise completely alone. The crib was assembled. The dresser was organized. The blackout curtains were up. Conrad met her there the same afternoon. He sat at her kitchen table with 3 folders and a laptop and the particular focused energy of a lawyer who has been waiting a long time to move. Tae-jun's documents had arrived. Conrad had spent the past 36 hours reviewing them, and the change in his posture when she opened the door told her everything she needed to know before he said a word. "The materials are extraordinary," he said, before he'd even taken off his coat. 4 independent medical evaluations from Augustus's physicians, all performed within 6 months of the will's execution. Video recordings of 3 separate conversations with Augustus discussing the inheritance. He's articulate, detailed, fully oriented. And a letter. Conrad paused. "A personal letter from Augustus to you, written 8 months before he died and witnessed by 2 attorneys." Imani stood in her kitchen doorway. "What does it say?" "I haven't read it. It's sealed. It was always intended for you directly." She looked at the folder on the table. White, unremarkable, the kind of folder that held either nothing or everything. "Sterling's medical challenge," she said, "collapses with this evidence. His expert witnesses can be cross-examined against 4 independent contemporaneous evaluations. The recordings alone would likely cause his attorneys to advise withdrawal." Conrad's voice was controlled, but she could hear the current underneath it. "If we present this at next month's hearing, we win, Imani." She looked at the folder. She didn't reach for it yet. "What does it cost, Tae-jun?" Conrad was quiet for a moment. "His direct relationship with Augustus will be part of the court record. That relationship, examined carefully, raises questions about the Baekryong syndicate's legitimate business operations. It doesn't constitute criminal exposure on its own, but it opens doors. Doors that federal investigators could walk through." Yes, she sat down at the table. She looked at the folders arranged neatly in front of her inheritance, her father's proof, the cost of winning, and she thought about the particular cruelty of being handed a victory that required someone else to bleed for it. He knew this when he gave the documents to Conrad, she said. I would assume so. She reached for the sealed letter and held it without opening it. Give me tonight, she said. Conrad nodded and gathered his coat and left. He didn't tell her what he thought she should do, and she gave him credit for it. She sat with the sealed letter for a long time before she opened it. Amara was in the bassinet they had moved from. The hospital, Tae-jun had arranged that, efficient, silent, along with a car service and 3 days of meals she hadn't asked for left on the kitchen counter. She hadn't thanked him. She wasn't sure yet whether to. She opened the letter. The handwriting was neat and slightly cramped, the handwriting of a man who was precise about language. It was 3 pages. She read it twice, the way she read everything important. Augustus Wycliffe admitted everything, not in the legal language of the will and the accompanying documents, but in plain sentences that had clearly cost him to write. He had loved her mother. He had been afraid of his family, and more afraid, she understood reading between his careful words, of the version of himself that would have to be honest about what that love meant. He had told himself that staying away protected Diane and the child from the ugliness his family would bring. He understood, now he wrote, that this was the story a man tells himself when he does not want to face what he's actually doing, which is choosing comfort over courage. He had watched her. He had been proud of her in the way of a man who has no right to be proud, who has not earned the feeling but cannot stop having it. He had seen her on a panel at a finance conference in Chicago. She had spoken sharply and well about something she clearly understood deeply, and he had sat in the back of the room and thought, I made her. I made nothing else in my life worth half this much. He hadn't approached her then. He hadn't approached her ever. His greatest failing, he wrote, was not the silence. It was the distance he kept, even while watching. He could have been present. He chose to be a ghost. He called it protection when it was, in the end, just fear that she would look at him the way he deserved to be looked at, and he was not brave enough to stand in that. I built a garden at the estate in the last 20 years. The letter said near the end, I do not know why I am telling you this, except that it is the most honest thing I have done. I planted things that would take decades to mature because I needed to believe in continuity. I am not asking you to forgive me. I am asking only that someday, if you are willing, you see what grows when a man finally decides to tend something rather than walk away from it. My greatest regret is not losing a portion of my fortune. It is never hearing you call me Dad, your father Augustus. Imani sat with the letter for a long time after she finished reading it. She was not crying. She noticed this with a kind of detached curiosity, the way she sometimes noticed her own emotional reactions from a slight distance as data rather than experience. She felt something large and complicated that didn't have a clean name, not grief exactly, not anger exactly, though both were present. Something more like green wood splitting, the feeling of a room you have been trying to find the door to for your entire life, and when you finally get inside, it is smaller than you expected, and the person who should be in it has just left. She set the letter down. She picked up her phone. She called Tae-jun. He answered immediately, which meant he hadn't been sleeping. The evidence, she said. You understood completely what using it would cost you. Yes. And you gave it to Conrad anyway. Yes. I need to know if you did that because you believe it's right or because you're... Imani, his voice was quiet, not defensive, not performing anything. Just direct in the way she had once loved and then learned to be suspicious of, and was now trying to re-examine with less distortion. I did it because Augustus trusted me with those documents for this exact purpose. He anticipated Sterling's move and he gave me the tools to counter it. Using them to protect what he built for you is the only honest thing I can do with what he gave me. A pause. And because I'm trying, very badly and probably too late, to stop making decisions about your life without you. She was quiet for a moment. Okay, she said. That's all? That's all for tonight. She looked at the letter on the table. Get some sleep, Tae-jun. She hung up. She didn't sleep for another 2 hours. Her mother arrived on the 5th day. Diane Bellrose was 61 and carried herself with the specific dignity of a woman who had raised a child alone and done it well and knew it. She came through the door with a rolling suitcase and looked at Amara for approximately 4 seconds before she sat down and held the baby with the competence of someone for whom this was not new territory. And then she looked at Imani over the baby's head with eyes that were already asking the question. "Tell me," Diane said. Imani told her. All of it. She sat across from her mother at the kitchen table and laid it out the same way she had organized it for herself in order, without editorializing, tracking the facts before the feelings. Augustus, the Will Sterling Tae-jun, the 2 years, the 3 years, the insurance, the letter. Diane listened without interrupting. This was something Imani had inherited from her, the ability to receive information without immediately processing it out loud, to hold it internally before responding. When Imani finished, Diane was quiet for a long time. "I knew he was alive," she said finally. Imani looked at her. "I knew he was alive until about 18 months ago," Diane said. "I didn't know he was sick. I didn't know he'd died. But I knew he hadn't." She stopped, adjusted her hold on Amara. "I always knew the story I told you wasn't entirely true. I told you he died because..." She stopped again. This time the stop was different. Longer. The kind that means the word underneath is the one you've been carrying for 30 years and haven't said aloud. Because the truth was too complicated to give a 7-year-old, and then it became too complicated to undo. "Mom, I know. You let me grieve someone who was alive." "Yes." Diane looked at her directly. "Yes, I did. And I've lived with that." The kitchen was very quiet. Amara made a small sound, and Diane adjusted her automatically, the motion so practiced it looked like breathing. "He sent money," Imani said. "You told me you sent it back." "I did send it back, but you knew who it was from." "Yes. So you knew his name, you knew he existed. And you never..." Imani stopped herself. She pressed her hand flat on the table and looked at it and thought about what she actually needed from this conversation, which was not to wound her mother and was not to perform betrayal, but was something more precise, the truth. Just the truth, finally, with no edges taken off for manageability. "I needed to know he existed," she said. "Not that he was a good man or that he deserved anything. Just that he was real. I needed that." Diane didn't defend herself. This too Imani had inherited. "I know," her mother said. "I thought I was protecting you. I understand now that I was also protecting myself from a conversation I didn't want to have." She looked at Amara. "I look at her, and I understand things I didn't let myself understand before." They sat in the kitchen for a long time after that, not resolving anything. Because some things don't resolve in a single conversation, they just become part of the architecture of the relationship. Load-bearing and complicated, and requiring ongoing maintenance. But they sat together, and that was something. The letter from Sterling's attorneys arrived 8 days after Imani left the hospital. Conrad called her before she'd finished reading it. "They've produced a medical evaluation," he said. His voice was controlled, but she could hear the tension underneath it, the specific strain of a lawyer whose timeline has just been compressed. Dr. Harlan Pruitt, geriatric psychiatrist, hired by Wycliffe Corporate Counsel. The evaluation claims Augustus demonstrated significant markers of dementia-adjacent cognitive impairment in the 3 years before his death. "We have 4 evaluations that say the opposite." "We do. But Pruitt is established. He's testified in 7 estate challenge cases in the last decade, and he's won 4 of them." Conrad paused. "Sterling filed a motion this morning to accelerate the hearing to 2 weeks from today. His argument is that the estate is in administrative limbo, and the delay is causing material harm to Wycliffe Crown's operations." "Can they do that?" "The judge has discretion. Given the hospital's size and the number of employees affected by the administrative uncertainty, there's a reasonable argument for acceleration." Another pause. Shorter. "The judge granted the motion an hour ago. 2 weeks." Imani was standing in her kitchen. She had Amara in a carrier. Against her chest, she had learned in the past week that the carrier was the only thing that reliably produced silence. The baby apparently requiring constant confirmation of proximity, and she was 11 days out of surgery, and she had 2 weeks. "What do we need to do?" she said. "We need Tae-jun's documentation formally submitted to the court record." I've filed the paperwork, but Sterling's attorneys are challenging the admissibility on the grounds that the documentation was obtained through an undisclosed third-party arrangement. Conrad's voice went careful. They're arguing that the provenance of the materials, specifically Tae-jun's relationship with Augustus, taints their reliability. That's absurd. Independent medical evaluations don't become invalid because of who provided them. No, but it creates a procedural dispute that requires a preliminary hearing to resolve. And the preliminary hearing is scheduled for. He stopped. Conrad, tomorrow morning. Imani closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Okay, she said. Where do I need to be? The preliminary hearing was in a downtown courthouse that smelled like institutional carpeting and decades of contested decisions. Imani arrived with Conrad and took a seat at the respondent's table and looked at Sterling across the aisle and thought, 2 weeks ago, I didn't know you existed. It was still strange, not in the way she'd expected, not emotional, not resonant. More like wearing a garment that didn't yet fit the shape of her body. She had a half-brother. She could see faintly the genetic echo of something shared the set of the jaw, maybe, or the way he held himself under pressure. It didn't make her feel anything warm. It made her feel like a person looking at a map of terrain she'd never been allowed to walk through. Sterling's attorneys argued for 40 minutes that Tae-jun's documentation should be excluded from the evidentiary record on the grounds that his relationship with Augustus constituted an undisclosed conflict of interest that rendered the materials unreliable. Conrad argued for 20 minutes that the materials were independently verifiable, that the medical evaluations had been conducted by licensed physicians with no financial relationship to either party, and that the recorded conversations spoke for themselves. The judge, a woman in her 60s with the particular economy of movement that comes from 30 years on the bench, listened to both arguments without visible reaction. Then she asked one question. Counsel for the respondent. The documentation was in the possession of Mr. Kang Tae-jun for over a year before it was produced. Why was it not submitted to the court immediately, upon the filing of the inheritance challenge? Conrad stood. Your Honor, Mr. Kang was not aware that the challenge had been filed. The estate's communication with Mr. Kang regarding the inheritance proceedings was, that's not what I asked. The judge looked at Conrad over her glasses. I asked why the documentation was not submitted, not why Mr. Kang was unaware of the filing. Those are two different questions. Conrad stopped, and in the pause that followed the brief, professional pause of a lawyer recalculating Imani, understood something cold and specific. Sterling's attorneys had done their homework. And the judge was asking was the right question, and it didn't have a clean, honest answer, was that Tae-jun had held the documents back, because producing them would expose his mushrooms, a sound like green wood splitting, and he had only released them when Imani confronted him, and that sequence of events, examined under the fluorescent lights of a federal courtroom, looked considerably less straightforward than it had in a hospital room at 2 a.m. The judge reserved her ruling. Outside the courthouse, in the gray February wind off the water, Imani stood beside Conrad while he talked, and she processed what she'd just watched happen, which was her case, developing a crack she hadn't seen coming. It's not fatal, Conrad said. The ruling could go either way. The materials are genuinely independent. The physicians had no relationship with Tae-jun or the syndicate, and their evaluations stand on their own clinical basis. But if the judge excludes them, then we go to the hearing with your documentation and mine without the medical evaluations or the recordings, and Sterling's expert becomes considerably more influential. And our chances. Conrad was quiet for half a beat. Reduced. Imani looked out at the water. The sound was flat and gray, the kind of Seattle afternoon that erased the horizon and made it impossible to tell where the water ended and the sky began. There has to be something else, she said. Sterling has been running this sabotage campaign for over a year. The insurance, the professional references, the credit accounts. Somewhere in that, there's a paper trail that leads directly back to him. Finding it in 2 weeks. I don't need to find it in 2 weeks. I need to find enough of it in 2 weeks to change the pressure in the room. She turned to Conrad. He's not operating alone. The insurance suspension was filed through a law firm. The professional interference required someone with access to my network. Someone inside Sterling's operation ran this. Find me that person. Conrad looked at her. Something in his expression shifted a recalibration, the same kind she had seen in Tae-jun, the adjustment that happened when a person realized they were no longer talking to someone who needed managing. I'll need additional investigators, he said. Hire them. The cost, Conrad. She looked at him steadily. I'm the heir to $800 million. Hire the investigators. He pulled out his phone. The call came 9 days before the hearing. Imani was at her kitchen table, Amara asleep in the next room. A sound inheritance documents spread in front of her in the organized chaos of someone who had been working the same problem from multiple angles for a week and was starting to find the places where the angles intersected when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer, she answered, Ms. Bellrose. A woman's voice. Low, measured, slightly careful in the way of someone who has been deciding whether to make this call for longer than the call itself will take. My name is Vivian Wycliffe. I'm Sterling's younger sister. A pause. I believe we share a father. Imani sat very still. I'm listening, she said. I can't talk long, Vivian said. I'm calling from a personal phone Sterling doesn't know I have. I've been a brief stop. The sound of someone breathing steadily through something that cost them. I've been aware of your existence for approximately 8 months. Sterling told me when he was certain you were going to pursue the inheritance. He told me because he expected me to help him manage you. And you didn't. And I didn't. Another pause. Miss Bellrose, I have documents. Internal records from Sterling's office operations over the past 18 months. Communication logs, authorization records, payment trails. He ran the sabotage campaign through a private operations team, 4 people, all of them embedded in Wycliffe Corporate Services. Her voice was very controlled. He personally authorized every action, the insurance suspension, the credit accounts, the professional interference, a beat. There is an email chain. Sterling wrote it himself. The subject line is your name. The room contracted around Imani the same way it had in the hospital when Tae-jun first said Augustus Wycliffe's name. The same inch-inward sensation of reality, adjusting to accommodate something that was always true but has only just become visible. Why are you coming to me? Imani said. Because I watched Sterling authorize the cancellation of a pregnant woman's insurance. Vivian's voice was still controlled, but something had thinned in it, the very edge of something rawer underneath the composure. I watched him do it and I thought, this is my sister. And I didn't stop him. And I have been carrying that for 2 months. A breath. I'm not doing it anymore. Imani looked at the documents spread across her table. $800 million and a letter from a dead man and a sister she hadn't known existed calling from a secret phone. Can you get me the documents? She said. I already have them, Vivian said. Tell me where to send them. And the case that Imani had been building from wreckage from canceled insurance and hospital floors and the long archaeology of decisions made without her suddenly had something she hadn't anticipated. Not just evidence of what Sterling had done. A witness who had been inside the room when he did it. Sterling Wycliffe had spent 18 months trying to erase his half-sister before she could claim what belonged to her, and in doing so he had made one catastrophic miscalculation. He had underestimated how much his other sister had been watching and what she was willing to do with what she'd seen. Imani gave Vivienne the secure email address Conrad had set up for exactly this kind of transmission, and hung up and sat in her kitchen in the quiet while Amara breathed in the next room. And for the first time since she had stood in the rain outside Wycliffe Crown Medical Center with her maternity bag and no options, she felt something shift in her chest that was not quite hope. Hope was too soft a word for it, but was something in that territory. Then her phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. No name. Just a photograph. She opened it. It was a screenshot of a court filing. Timestamped 40 minutes ago. Sterling Wycliffe had filed an emergency motion to have Tae-jun Kang formally investigated as a material witness with undisclosed conflicts, and had attached to that motion a 30-page brief that Imani could see. Even in the screenshots, reduced resolution contained considerably more information about the Baekryong syndicate than Sterling had previously disclosed, possessing. Not enough for criminal prosecution, but enough she could see with the precision of someone who understood how information functioned as a weapon to trigger a federal inquiry. And a federal inquiry, even a preliminary one, even one that found nothing, would freeze Tae-jun's legitimate businesses, create enough uncertainty to collapse several pending real estate transactions, and signal to every legitimate partner the Baekryong syndicate had built over the last decade that association carried risk. Sterling had decided that burning both of them was preferable to losing. He had moved first. Imani stood up from the table. She stood in the middle of her kitchen splitting, in the apartment that had been ready for a baby she'd planned to raise alone. Surrounded by the documents of an inheritance she had not known existed 2 weeks ago, and she understood that the war had just changed shape completely. Sterling wasn't trying to outlast her anymore. He was trying to burn the ground she was standing on and take Tae-jun down with it, and force her to choose between pressing forward and destroying the man who had in his deeply flawed and unilateral and damage-producing way been trying to protect her since before she'd known she needed it. She called Tae-jun. He picked up in one ring. "I know," he said, before she could say anything. "I've seen it. Are you?" "I'm fine." His voice was flat and precise and completely controlled, the voice of a man who had been operating in dangerous situations for long enough that crisis didn't change his register. It just stripped away everything that wasn't essential. "My attorneys are already filing a response. This doesn't end the case. He's trying to force you to withdraw support from my claim." "Yes. If you withdraw, I'm not withdrawing." He said it with a finality that had no performance in it. "I'm not withdrawing, Imani." She stood in her kitchen. "He's going to come at you harder if you don't," she said. "I know. This could be the beginning of something that costs you everything you've built." "I know." A silence. Tae-jun. Her voice was different now, not the controlled analytical voice she'd been using for 2 weeks, not the flat protective voice she'd constructed for situations where she needed to not be vulnerable. Something more direct than both. "Why?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought the line had dropped. Then he said, "Because some things you can't fix by leaving. And I'm done trying." She looked at the photograph of the court filing on her phone. Outside, the rain had stopped. For the first time in days, the sky over Seattle had thinned to a pale, tentative gray that wasn't quite light, but was moving toward it. Imani put the phone down. She picked up Conrad's number. She had 9 days. She had Vivian's documents. She had a man who was choosing, for the first time, to take the hit rather than disappear from it. And she had some things Sterling Wycliffe had never once accounted for in all his careful, patient, methodical erasure. She was her father's daughter, and her father had built things designed to outlast him. And Imani Bellrose had spent 32 years becoming precisely the kind of woman that men like Sterling assumed they could exhaust if they were just patient enough and thorough enough and willing enough to play the long game. She was patient. She was thorough. And she was done letting other people decide how long the game lasted. 9 days. Imani wrote it on a piece of paper and taped it to the kitchen cabinet above her coffee maker because she needed to see it every morning, not as a countdown toward fear, but as a measurement of what was still available. 9 days was not nothing. 9 days handled correctly was enough to change the shape of a room. She called Conrad at 6 the next morning. Vivian's documents arrived, he said, before she could speak. He'd been up already. She could hear it in his voice, the flat, stripped quality of someone who had been working through the night and was running on the particular fuel of a case that had suddenly become winnable. "I've been reviewing them since 2 a.m. Imani. This is the email chain alone." Sterling authorized every action personally. The insurance suspension has his digital signature on the approval request. The professional interference, he used a private communications platform that he apparently believed was secure. But Vivian had administrative access. "Can we use it? We'll need to sign an affidavit attesting to the provenance. She'll need to testify, potentially. She'll do it." "You've confirmed that. I'm confirming it now." Imani poured coffee. The incision across her abdomen pulled when she reached for the mug, and she registered the pain and moved through it. She had been moving through pain for 2 weeks. She was getting good at it. What about the federal inquiry Sterling triggered against Tae-jun? Conrad's pause was briefer than she expected. That's the more complicated piece. The filing is legitimate. Sterling had enough on the Baekryong syndicate's legitimate business connections to support a request for investigation. Federal investigators have 48 hours to decide whether to open a preliminary inquiry. 48 hours from when? From yesterday's filing. She set the mug down. By 5 p. She looked at the piece of paper taped above the cabinet. 9 days. Except the first real battle wasn't in 9 days. It was in 11 hours. What does Tae-jun need? She said. His attorneys have filed a response establishing that the legitimate businesses are independently operated, and the documentation Sterling submitted was. Conrad stopped. The honest answer is that Tae-jun's attorneys are very good, but Sterling's brief was thorough. If federal investigators decide to open even a preliminary inquiry, it creates a cloud over the evidentiary materials Tae-jun provided. Sterling's attorneys will argue that materials from a party under federal investigation carry diminished reliability. So Sterling's plan is to open a federal inquiry, use the inquiry to taint Tae-jun's evidence, and walk into the hearing in 9 days with our best documentation compromised. Yes, Imani picked up the mug. Then we need to give them a reason not to open the inquiry. That's not typically something. I know how federal decision-making works, Conrad. She drank. Find me the name of the supervising attorney in the U.S. Attorney's office who would handle an inquiry into an organization like the Baekryong Syndicate. Not to contact them improperly. I want to understand who's making the decision and what factors they're weighing. Conrad was quiet for a moment. I can do that. And call Vivian. I need her in person today. She hung up and went to feed Amara, who had woken up and was announcing this fact with the full force of her 11-day-old lungs. And Imani stood in the small room, with the gray morning light coming through, the blackout curtains. She'd left partially open, and she held her daughter and thought about the architecture of the next 9 days with the same precision she brought to any complex financial model. Identify the variables, map the dependencies, find the single point of failure on the other side. Sterling's single point of failure was the same as any man who had been operating from a position of unchallenged power for too long. He had underestimated what the other people in the room were willing to do. Vivian Wycliffe arrived at 11. She was 37, which meant she and Imani were 5 years apart, close enough that in another life they might have been friends before they were anything else. She was slim and pale, where Sterling was silver and constructed, and she moved with the slightly over-controlled precision of someone who had spent a long time being careful about how much space she took up. She looked at Imani the way Imani had looked at the DNA report, like she was trying to map the genetic distance between 2 points that had been kept artificially far apart. She looked at Amara for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, "She has Augustus's forehead." Imani looked at her daughter. "How would you know?" "There's a photograph in the estate library. Augustus at about 3 months. The shape is." Vivian stopped herself. Sat down at the kitchen table without being asked. Put her bag on the floor. Her hands were steady, but she was gripping the bag strap a half-second longer than necessary before she let it go. "I've been trying to find a way to contact you for 2 months. Every time I started, I talked myself out of it. What changed?" "The insurance." Vivian's voice went flat. Not cold flat. The way voices go when they're carrying weight they've been carrying for a while and have stopped trying to inflect around it. "I was in Sterling's office when he approved it. I didn't know what it was until afterward, when I saw the paperwork in the system. I saw your name. I saw the date February 9th. I knew you were pregnant." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I did the math. You knew he was targeting a pregnant woman." "Yes." "And you sat on it for 2 months." "Yes." Vivian held her gaze and didn't defend it. "I'm not asking you to give me credit for finally doing the right thing. I know what 2 months costs." Imani studied her. Vivian Wycliffe had grown up in the Wycliffe dynasty with all its privileges and constraints, with Sterling as an older brother whose model of power she had either followed or quietly resisted for decades, and the fact that she was sitting at Imani's kitchen table with a bag full of documents. Her brother didn't know she had said something about which choice she'd been making internally for a long time before this. I need you to sign an affidavit, Imani said. I need you to testify at the hearing if Conrad determines it's necessary. And I need you to understand that once you do this, your relationship with Sterling is not going to survive it. I know he'll cut you off, professionally, financially. I have my own money, Vivian said. I'm a physician. I've been a practicing physician for 12 years. Sterling's estate connections make my life comfortable, but they don't make my life. She looked at Imani steadily. I'm not doing this because I need something from you. I'm doing it because I watched my brother try to leave his pregnant sister outside a hospital in February, and I have been ashamed of myself ever since. Imani was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Conrad is going to need 3 hours with you. Can you stay? I can stay. By 4:30 that afternoon, the U.S. Attorney's Office had not opened a preliminary inquiry into the Baekryong syndicate. Tae-jun's attorneys called Conrad with the news at 4:47. The decision, they believed, had been influenced by the response brief, a 60-page document establishing that the syndicate's legitimate operations were independently managed, that Sterling's evidence had been selectively compiled, and that the filing bore the hallmarks of litigation-adjacent pressure rather than genuine law enforcement concern. The supervising attorney had apparently used exactly the phrase litigation-adjacent pressure in declining to open the inquiry, which suggested she had seen this move before and had limited patience for it. Conrad called Imani. Sterling's gambit failed, he said. For now, he agreed. He can refile with additional evidence. But the threshold for a second filing is higher, and the response we built would apply to any second attempt. How much time does this buy us? It gets us to the hearing with Tae-jun's evidence intact. Imani exhaled. The pull across her incision had been getting worse. Through the afternoon, she had been sitting at the kitchen table, too long, too tense, the kind of sustained physical contraction that C-section recovery explicitly warned against. She stood up carefully and put one hand on the back of the chair. Then we go to the hearing, she said. The 4 days before the hearing were the kind of days that don't have a rhythm. They had a texture dense, compressed, every hour carrying the weight of 3, but no rhythm, no routine. Imani worked in 4-hour stretches between Amara's feedings, building her understanding of the Wycliffe Crown financial structure with the same systematic rigor she would have brought to any complex investment position. She read every document Conrad gave her. She asked questions about the ones she didn't understand and remembered the answers, and asked follow-up questions that made Conrad's responses gradually shift from explanatory to collaborative. The adjustment that happened when a lawyer realized they weren't briefing a client anymore, they were working with one. Tage came twice. The first time, she let him sit at the kitchen table while Conrad walked through the evidentiary strategy, and she let him absorb the information the way he absorbed everything without visible reaction, processing internally. She'd asking 2 or 3 questions that were precise enough to reveal that he'd understood everything before he asked them. His attorneys had recommended he maintain distance from the active case management to avoid any further appearance of undue influence. He came anyway. She didn't ask him to leave. The second time he came alone, late after Amara was down and Conrad had gone, and he sat across from her at the kitchen table and said, "The federal inquiry decision. My attorneys believe Sterling will make a second attempt. After the hearing before. Possibly tomorrow." She looked at him. He had not slept properly in days. She could see it in the way he held his head, slightly heavier than usual, the particular set of exhaustion in someone who operates in controlled environments and has stopped being fully controlled. His coat was over the back of the chair. For the first time in 2 weeks, he looked like something other than an immovable object. "What happens to the syndicate's operations if an inquiry opens?" she said. "Several real estate transactions freeze. 2 hospitality contracts become untenable because the counterparties have public company obligations. Approximately 60 people in the legitimate businesses lose their positions because the companies become too uncertain to maintain staffing." He said it without inflection. "The way an accountant presents a loss column. And the leverage I use to keep the syndicate's criminal operations, manage the relationships, the informal agreements, those become unstable. Dangerous." Yes, she held his gaze. Tae-jun, if Sterling files again and the inquiry opens, can you survive it? He looked at her for a long moment. Long enough that she understood the answer was more complicated than yes or no. The legitimate businesses can survive scrutiny, he said finally. The criminal operations and inquiry wouldn't necessarily find prosecutable evidence. But the instability it creates in the relationships I manage would. He stopped. There are people I've kept agreements with for years who use the stability of those agreements to stay away from things that would cause more harm. If that stability disappears, they don't disappear with it. She understood what he was saying. The syndicate wasn't just a criminal operation, protecting its own interests. It was a set of managed relationships that, through Tae-jun's particular version of control, were keeping something messier from existing in its place. The morality of that was genuinely complicated, and she wasn't going to resolve it sitting at her kitchen table at 11 p. 4 days before the most important hearing of her life. What she understood, simply and clearly, was that Sterling had aimed precisely at the thing most likely to force Tae-jun to withdraw support from her case, and that Tae-jun had not withdrawn it. Go home, she said. Sleep. You being here doesn't change what happens tomorrow. Go sleep. He stood, picked up his coat. At the door he stopped, not turning around, and said, whatever the outcome of the hearing, you know that. She knew what he meant. I know, she said. He left. Sterling filed the second inquiry request at 7 the next morning. Imani was feeding Amara when Conrad called. She switched the phone to speaker and held the baby and listened and didn't let her voice change. His evidence package this time includes financial documents, Conrad said. Tae-jun's attorneys believe Sterling accessed them through a former Baekryong associate who left the organization 18 months ago. Are they genuine? They appear to be. They document several transactions from 4 and 5 years ago that are ambiguous. Not clearly prosecutable, but sufficient to elevate the inquiry threshold. The baby finished eating and Imani settled her against her shoulder and stood up and paced the length of the kitchen, the slow, deliberate pace of someone managing their own adrenaline. How much time does the U.S. Attorney's Office have to decide? 24 hours for a preliminary determination. Given the elevated evidence package, my read is that they open the inquiry. If they open it 3 days before the hearing, Sterling's attorneys immediately file a motion to delay the hearing pending the inquiry's resolution. How long would that take? Months. Possibly a year. Imani stopped pacing. She stood in the middle of her kitchen and looked at the piece of paper still taped above the coffee maker that said 9 days, now crossed down to 4, and she felt the specific quality of the situation, the particular shape of being outmaneuvered by someone who had been doing this longer and had more resources and had planned for contingencies she was only discovering existed. Then she thought about Vivienne. She called Tae-jun. He picked up immediately. She could hear road noise. He was in a car, moving. The second filing, she said. I know. My attorneys have it. Tae-jun, is there anything in those financial documents that, if examined, would create criminal exposure for you personally? A pause. The road noise continued. No, he said. The transactions are structured to be defensible. They look bad. They're not illegal. If I asked you to sit down with the U.S. Attorney's Office voluntarily today and walk them through the transactions and the documentation and give them everything, wouldn't it hold up? Voluntary disclosure is. He stopped. She could hear him recalibrating. It's an unusual move. It takes the inquiry request out of Sterling's hands. If you go to them first, the dynamic changes. They're not opening an inquiry triggered by a litigation adversary. They're receiving voluntary cooperation from a party who initiated contact. The road noise stopped. He had pulled over somewhere. That exposes the syndicate's operations to scrutiny I would not normally invite, he said. I know if they find anything. Tae-jun. She kept her voice level. I'm not asking you to do this. I'm telling you that it's a viable play if the transactions are as clean as you say. And I'm telling you that if you decide not to, I will find another way. I always find another way. She paused. But if you're going to take a risk for this, take this one. It's the one that actually shifts the board. Silence. Long enough that she thought he might say no, long enough that she had already started building the alternative in her head. "Give me 2 hours," he said. He hung up. Kang Tae-jun walked into the U.S. Attorney's office in downtown Seattle at 2:15 that afternoon with his lead attorney and a banker's box of financial documentation and requested a voluntary disclosure meeting. Imani knew because his attorney texted Conrad. Conrad called Imani. Imani was sitting in her living room with Amara asleep on her chest because that was the only position in which either of them had been able to be still for the past 4 hours, and she received the information and looked at the ceiling and breathed. The meeting lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. At 6 p.m., the U.S. Attorney's Office notified Sterling's attorneys that the second inquiry request was under review and a decision would follow, but that the voluntary disclosure process was now active, which under federal procedure meant that the inquiry, if opened, would run concurrent to rather than superseding any pending civil proceedings. Sterling could not use the inquiry to delay the hearing. Imani read the notification Conrad forwarded to her and sat very still for a moment, and then said, to no one in particular, to the sleeping baby on her chest, "Okay." The hearing was on a Thursday. The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected, not the vast, wood-paneled chambers of legal dramas, but a working room, functional and slightly worn, with fluorescent lighting that was indifferent to what it illuminated. She sat beside Conrad at the respondent's table, and across the aisle, Sterling sat with 2 attorneys and a paralegal, and between them was the distance of a contested inheritance, 3 decades of silence, and a question about whether a dying man's wishes meant anything when his legitimate heir had the resources to contest them. The judge was the same woman from the preliminary hearing. She looked at both tables with the same economy she'd used before measuring, not warming. Sterling's attorney went first. He was precise and thorough, and the medical evaluation was his centerpiece, Doctor. Pruitt on the stand for 40 minutes, calm and credentialed, and specific about the markers of cognitive decline he claimed to have identified in Augustus Wycliffe's final years. He cited 3 evaluations performed by Augustus's own physicians, which he acknowledged were inconsistent with his findings, and attributed the inconsistency to the well-documented tendency of treating physicians to minimize cognitive deterioration in long-term patients. He was good. Imani watched him work and gave him credit for it. Conrad cross-examined Pruitt for 25 minutes. He was methodical and unhurried, which was the right tone for dismantling an expert by degrees. He established that Pruitt had been retained by Wycliffe Corporate Counsel rather than by any neutral party. He established that Pruitt had reviewed no contemporaneous recordings of Augustus in conversation. He established that Pruitt's evaluation had been conducted posthumously from documentation only, which was standard in estate challenges, but meaningfully different from direct clinical observation. Then Conrad played the first recording. Augustus Wycliffe's voice filled the courtroom clear, unhurried, precise. He was discussing the structure of the inheritance with Conrad directly, in a conversation dated 17 months before his death. He referenced specific legal provisions, specific percentages, specific contingencies. He demonstrated, across 6 minutes of unedited audio, a mind that was tracking multiple legal concepts simultaneously and integrating them coherently. Pruitt's composure remained intact. Sterling's attorneys had clearly prepared him for this. Conrad played the second recording, and the third. By the third recording, something had shifted in the room, not dramatically, not visibly in any single person, but in the accumulated weight of evidence, the way a room shifts when a window opens and the air pressure changes. The judge made a note. Pruitt was excused. Sterling's second witness was a former business associate who testified that Augustus had made significant errors in judgment in the last years of his life business decisions that didn't align with his historical pattern, unusual risk tolerance, inexplicable changes in preference. Conrad cross-examined for 12 minutes and established that 3 of the 4 business decisions the witness described had occurred before the period. Pruitt claimed cognitive decline had begun, and that the 4th had been made in consultation with a board of 7 directors who had raised no concerns at the time. Imani watched Sterling across the aisle through all of it. He had the stillness of a man who has been in high-stakes rooms before and knows how to wait. His expression revealed nothing. He sat with his hands folded in front of him and tracked every piece of testimony with the attention of someone taking inventory. Then Conrad presented Vivienne's affidavit. Sterling moved. It was small, a half-degree shift in his posture, a single moment where the control slipped, and then reasserted itself. His lead attorney leaned in and said something brief into his ear. Sterling didn't turn toward him. The affidavit described, in Vivienne Wycliffe's detailed, clinical physician's prose, the internal operations she had witnessed in Sterling's office. The authorization records, the communication logs, the payment trails, the email chain with Imani's name in the subject line. It was 3 pages of documentation from a first-hand witness with no financial stake in the outcome, who was, the affidavit established in its second paragraph, prepared to testify in person if the court required it. The judge read it. She looked up. "Counsel for the petitioner," she said. "I'd like to hear your response to the affidavit." Sterling's lead attorney stood. He began a response about the reliability of testimony from a disgruntled family member and the context necessary for understanding internal business communications. The judge let him speak for approximately 90 seconds. "I'm going to stop you there," she said, "because what I'm looking at is documentary evidence of deliberate interference with a litigant's access to medical care during a documented medical emergency. That is a significantly different category of behavior than the inheritance dispute before this court, and I want to be very clear that the court is aware of that distinction." She set the affidavit down. "We'll take a 20-minute recess." In the hallway during the recess, Imani stood with Conrad by a window that looked out over a rain-gray Seattle skyline and drank water from a plastic bottle and didn't say anything for a while. "She's going to rule in our favor," Conrad said. "Don't," Imani said. "The recordings alone. Don't say it until she says it." She looked out at the skyline. "What does Sterling do if she rules against him? He can appeal. He will appeal. But an appeal doesn't stop the inheritance transfer. It creates a parallel proceeding. You'd take your seat on the board while the appeal runs." She thought about that. Taking a seat on a board that had been trying to erase her existence for a year while the man who authorized that erasure appealed the ruling from a distance. "And the affidavit," she said. "The sabotage documentation. What does the judge do with it? It's potentially actionable separately." The insurance cancellation alone, Conrad stopped himself. Looked at her. "What do you want to do with it?" Imani looked at the skyline. She thought about Sterling in that courtroom the moment his posture had shifted, when Vivienne's name appeared in the documentation, the single fractional loss of composure. She thought to the letter from Augustus and the garden he'd spent 20 years planting because he needed to believe in something that would outlast him. She thought about Tae-jun in the U.S. Attorney's office with a banker's box of documentation, doing the most exposed and least strategic thing he had done in 30 years of careful operation because she had asked him to take the risk that actually shifted the board. She thought about Amara at home with her mother, who was learning that the women in her family had a tendency to carry impossible weights in silence and were perhaps, just perhaps, figuring out that there was a different way. "I want to negotiate," she said. Conrad looked at her. "Imani, after today's hearing, you have significance." "I know what I have." She turned from the window, "and I'm telling you I want to negotiate. Not because I'm afraid of a fight, because I've been watching men use power as a weapon for the past 3 weeks, and I'm not interested in becoming another version of that." She held his gaze. "Sterling is terrified. Vivienne is ready to testify, and he knows it. The judge just told him that she sees exactly what he did. He's cornered. A beat. Cornered men either surrender or destroy everything around them. I want to give him the option to surrender." Conrad was quiet for a moment. "A negotiated settlement," he said. "What are your terms?" "I'll tell him directly." "The court. After the ruling," she said. "When he knows what he's facing. Not before." The ruling came 40 minutes after the recess. It was not a final inheritance determination. This was a preliminary hearing on evidentiary admissibility and Sterling's cognitive challenge. The judge ruled that the challenge was unsupported by the evidence presented, that the recordings and independent medical evaluations were decisive on the question of competency, and that Sterling's challenge was dismissed with prejudice on the cognitive impairment theory. Dismissed with prejudice meant he couldn't refile the same challenge. He could still appeal on other grounds. He could still contest procedural elements. But the primary weapon he had built over 14 months, the argument that Augustus had not known what he was doing when he signed the will, was gone. The courtroom didn't react dramatically. Legal victories rarely produce drama in the room where they happened. The drama was in what came after, in the room outside, in the conversations that followed the documents being closed and the attorneys standing up and the judge stepping down from the bench. Sterling sat for a moment after the ruling before he stood. In that moment, the brief, unguarded moment between the ruling and the recovery, Imani saw something she hadn't expected. Not rage, not calculation, something that looked almost like exhaustion. He stood, buttoned his jacket. His attorneys were already moving toward him, already managing, already constructing the next strategic response. He let them converge, and then he looked across the aisle at Imani. One look, direct, without the corporate mask fully restored yet, and what she saw in his face was a man who had been fighting for a very long time and wasn't sure anymore what he was fighting for. She met his gaze, and she said quietly enough that it was only for him, "I'll be in touch." He looked at her for one more second. Then the mask came back. He turned away. His attorneys surrounded him, and they moved toward the exit as a unit. Imani stood at the respondent's table with Conrad beside her, and looked at the room, the fluorescent lights, the worn wood, the institutional carpeting, and she understood that she had just won the most important battle she had ever fought, and that winning it had cost more than she could fully calculate yet, and that the cost had been worth it, and that none of that made it simple. Her phone buzzed. Tae-jun, the text said only, "Well?" She typed back, dismissed with prejudice. 3 seconds. Good. She put the phone in her coat pocket. Conrad was already talking timeline. Next steps? The inheritance transfer process, the board seat, the procedural sequence. She heard him, tracked it, filed it. Outside the courthouse windows, the rain had stopped again, the same tentative reprieve as before, the sky thinning toward something that wasn't yet light, but was oriented in that direction. She was going to need to call Sterling's attorneys tomorrow and propose a meeting. She was going to need to construct her terms carefully, not punitive, not generous, precisely calibrated to give him an exit that his ego could survive while delivering everything she was owed. She was going to need to manage Vivian's position in whatever came after, because Vivian had burned her relationship with her brother. To hand Imani this and that debt, while not a financial one, was real. She was going to need to figure out what she and Tae-jun actually were and what they were going to become, and how to do that without either of them defaulting to their respective control mechanisms, his tendency to decide, hers to wall off. There was a tremendous amount of work still to do. She picked up her coat. "Conrad," she said, "I need to go home." He looked up from his notes. "Of course. Tomorrow we can—" "I know." She put her coat on, carefully, aware of the incision, aware of the specific geography of her own healing. "Tomorrow we will. But right now I need to go home and hold my daughter." She walked out of the courtroom. She walked through the marble lobby of the courthouse and through the heavy glass doors and into the Seattle air, cold, clean, carrying the particular mineral smell of rain that has just stopped. She stood on the courthouse steps for a moment. Below her, the city moved. Traffic, people, the gray water visible in the distance between buildings. The whole ordinary complexity of a Thursday afternoon in a city that had no idea what had just happened in the room she'd walked out of. She had 42% of an $800 million empire waiting to be transferred into her name. She had a 3-week-old daughter at home who needed her. She had a half-sister who had chosen her over the family she grew up in. She had a man who had finally stopped running the numbers on what loving her would cost him. And she had a father she would never meet, who had planted a garden he believed she might someday walk through. She thought about that garden. She thought about what it meant to tend something. Rather than walk away from it, the specific, unglamorous, years-long commitment of it, the faithfulness required to keep returning to the same ground, even when it didn't look like much was growing. She had a lot of ground to tend. She went to find a car. She called Sterling's attorneys the next morning at 8:45. Not at 9, which was when professional courtesies suggested you made calls of this nature. 8:45, because she wanted the first signal of the conversation to be that she was not operating on anyone else's schedule anymore. The paralegal, who answered, put her through in under 30 seconds, which told her that expecting the call and had told his people to take it immediately, which told her that last night, after the ruling, he had done the same thing she had done, sat down somewhere quiet and thought through the shape of what came next. His lead attorney came on the line. His name was Garrett Finch, and he had the voice of a man who had spent 40 years in rooms full of money and conflict and had developed the particular neutral precision of someone who long ago stopped having personal feelings about outcomes. Ms. Bellrose, he said, I imagine you'd like to discuss a path forward. I'd like to meet with Sterling directly, she said. Not through counsel. He and I in person. You can both have attorneys present. I want to talk to him. A pause. That's an unusual request at this stage. I'm aware. May I ask what the purpose of the direct meeting would be? You may not, she said pleasantly. I'll make that clear to him when we're in the room. What I can tell you is that I'm not coming to the meeting to humiliate him. I'm coming to offer him a way out of this that he can live with. She let that sit for a moment, which is more than he gave me. Another pause. Longer. I'll convey the request, Finch said. Tell him I'd like to meet today. Today, maybe tell him today. She kept her voice even. He'll agree. She hung up. She was right. Finch called back at 10:12 with a location a neutral law office downtown, the kind of space that existed specifically for situations where neither party wanted to be in the other's territory. 2 p.m. Conrad strongly recommended against meeting without more preparation. I'm prepared, Imani said. The optics of a direct negotiation at this stage. I'm not managing optics, Conrad. I'm ending this. She looked at him across her kitchen table. I need you to trust that I understand what I'm walking into. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, with the expression of a lawyer who has learned to identify the point at which a client has made their decision and additional counsel is no longer being processed. I'll drive you, he said. The office was on the 14th floor of a building, overlooking the Sound. The water was flat and pewter-colored under a February sky that had finally, tentatively, begun to show some thinning toward pale light. She noticed this on the way up in the elevator, the view, through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the water and the far smudge of the Olympic Peninsula, and she thought about Augustus's letter and the garden, and the fact that some things take decades to grow into what they were always going to be. Sterling was already in the conference room. He was alone, which surprised her. No attorneys immediately present, though she could see through the glass partition that Finch was standing in the hallway outside with 2 other men she didn't recognize. Sterling stood when she entered, which also surprised her. An automatic courtesy, the kind that gets trained into certain kinds of people, so early it becomes involuntary, even when everything else is at war. She sat across from him. Conrad sat to her right and opened a notepad but didn't write anything. Sterling sat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He looked tired. Not defeated. She didn't think Sterling Wycliffe was capable of looking defeated in any conventional sense. The architecture of his self-presentation was too entrenched for that. But tired. The particular tiredness of a man who has been running a complex, sustained operation and has just watched a significant piece of it fail, and who knows that what comes next is going to require a different quality of energy than what came before. You won yesterday, he said. His voice was even, informational. I know. Finch tells me you want to offer terms. I do. He looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't quite done in the hospital room, where he'd been performing confidence too actively to actually see her. She held the look without looking away and without performing anything in return. Before I do, she said, I need you to tell me something. Honestly. A beat. When did Augustus tell you about me? Something shifted in his face. Small, barely visible. The adjustment of a man encountering a question he had prepared to avoid and finding it sitting directly in front of him. 3 weeks before he died, Sterling said. He told you himself. Yes. What did he say? Sterling looked at the table. Then back at her. He said he had a daughter, that he had known about her for her entire life, that he had not been brave enough to know her. He paused. Those were his words. Not brave enough. She absorbed that. How did you respond? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then I told him I needed time to understand it. Another pause. He died 8 days later. We never spoke about it again. The room was very quiet. You were angry, she said. I was furious. The word came out with more force than he'd intended, and she could see him recalibrate, pulling back slightly, re-establishing the controlled register. He had spent 30 years watching another child. Another daughter. He'd watched you at a conference in Chicago. I found the photograph in his desk after he died, from a photographer he'd paid to be there. Just to see you. He had a photograph of you in his desk, and He stopped. His jaw tightened. I had sat next to him at dinner every Sunday for 40 years. There it was. Not the money, not the empire, not the dynasty. A man who had discovered that his father had loved at a distance in secret for 30 years, and had transferred all the anger that belonged to Augustus, who was dead and unreachable, onto the one person who remained. She had understood this, abstractly, from the documents and Conrad's explanations. Understanding it abstractly was different from sitting across from it and watching it breathe. You couldn't be angry at him, she said. He was dying when he told you. And then he was gone. Sterling looked at her. So you were angry at me instead, she said. Not accusatory, just naming the architecture. Yes, he said, after a moment. She nodded slowly. She thought about her mother, 61 years old, who had told a 7-year-old her father was dead because the truth was too complicated, and then had never found the moment to undo it. She thought about Augustus in the back of a conference room in Chicago, watching his daughter speak about a subject she clearly understood deeply, being proud of her in a way he had no right to. She thought about Tae-jun standing in her hospital room at 2 a.m, organized confession, delivered in flat, economical sentences, 30 years of arranged certainties finally being surrendered because they had cost too much and protected too little. She thought about the specific human capacity for taking pain that belongs to one person and redirecting it, with great precision and sustained effort, towards someone easier to reach. I'm not going to tell you I understand it, she said. What you did to me, the insurance, the year of sabotage before that. Standing in my hospital room and offering me 8 cents on the dollar with a smile on your face. She kept her voice even. I don't understand it in the sense of finding it acceptable, but I understand how it happened. Sterling held her gaze. I'm also not going to tell you that makes us even, she said. It doesn't. No, he said. Here are my terms. She glanced at Conrad, who had his pen ready. You retain your 58% of Wycliffe Crown Holdings and your current operational authority, with the exception of the areas I'm going to specify. I receive my 42% transferred cleanly within 30 days, with no further legal challenge. You formally recognize me as Augustus Wycliffe's biological daughter in all corporate documentation and in any public statements that become necessary. She paused. You compensate me for the documented financial damages from the sabotage campaign. Conrad has the figures. And you withdraw the federal inquiry request against Kang Tae-jun. The federal inquiry is not within my... Your attorney filed it, she said. Your attorney can unfiled it. Don't. She said the last word very calmly. Sterling was quiet. In exchange, she said, I keep Vivian's affidavit and the sabotage documentation out of the press. You're not publicly destroyed. The Wycliffe name remains functional. She let that sit. And I don't pursue the civil action that the insurance cancellation alone would support, which Conrad has told me is extremely viable given the documented medical emergency. The room was still. Sterling looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He looked at the window, at the pewter water, and the far edge of the peninsula. You could take more than this, he said. I could. Why don't you? She looked at him directly. Because I'm not doing this to take everything from you, Sterling. I'm doing this to take what's mine. She paused. Because someone very wise told me once that when you spend your life you should decide whether you're building it to protect yourself or to protect something larger than yourself. Augustus built this empire. She looked at the window. I'd rather see it become something worth having built than watch it collapse under the weight of what we've both spent the last year doing to each other. Sterling looked at her. She could not read fully what was in his face. There were too many layers, too many years of practiced control, too many rooms he had walked out of without showing anyone what they had cost him. But underneath all of that, underneath the silver hair and the expensive suit and the 40 years of Sunday, with a father who had been carrying a secret the whole time, she saw the same she had seen in the courthouse yesterday, in the brief fractional moment between the ruling and the recovery. A man who was very tired. "Give me the room for 10 minutes, he said. Imani looked at Conrad. He looked at her. They both stood. In the hallway, Conrad said nothing. He stood beside her and looked at the water through the exterior windows and waited with the patience of a man who had learned that some negotiations required the principals to be alone with themselves. For a while, before they could agree to anything real. 8 minutes later, the conference room door opened. "Miss Bellrose," Finch said from the doorway. "Mr. Wycliffe would like to continue." The settlement signed 4 days later. The document was 43 pages long. Conrad had coined through with the attention of a man protecting something he had spent 7 years building toward. The signing happened in the same conference room, the same pewter water view, with fewer people present than the preceding weeks might have suggested, just Imani and Sterling, and their respective legal counsel and a notary. Sterling signed first. His pen moved without hesitation, across the signature line, the way people sign things when the decision has already been fully made, and the signing is just the physical expression of it. Imani signed second. She wrote her name, Imani Diane Bellrose, in the clear, deliberate handwriting she'd had since high school, when a teacher had told her that a signature was a statement, and she had taken that seriously. The notary stamped it. It was done. Sterling stood and buttoned his jacket. He looked at Imani. "There's one more thing," he said. Not in the agreement. She waited. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced an envelope. White, slightly worn at the edges, the kind of worn that comes from being carried for weeks. He held it out. She took it. "He left it for me," Sterling said. "To give to you, if we ever got to this point." His voice was flat, controlled, giving nothing away except the fact that carrying this particular errand had cost him something. "I almost didn't bring it today." She looked at the envelope. Her name was on the front, in handwriting she recognized, now from the letter Conrad had given her Augustus Wycliffe's neat, slightly cramped hand. "Thank you," she said. Sterling nodded once. He picked up his coat and walked out of the room without looking back, and Finch and the other attorneys followed him, and the room was quiet. Conrad touched her arm gently. "I'll wait outside," he said. She sat down. She opened the envelope. It was not a letter this time. It was a single folded card, the kind that comes with flowers, small and cream-colored. On it, in the same handwriting, was an address she didn't recognize in the East Side suburbs, and a single line beneath it. "The garden is still there. The caretaker's name is Marcos. He's been expecting someone." Nothing else. No apology. No explanation. He had already spent those as the other letter. This was just the coordinates. She sat with the card for a long time. She went to the estate 3 weeks later. Not because she was ready. She didn't think ready was the right category for something like this. She went because Amara was 6 weeks old, and the incision had healed enough that Imani could move without constant awareness of it, and because her mother was in Seattle for another 2 weeks and could watch the baby, and because she had been carrying the card in her coat pocket since the signing, and it was time to stop carrying it and go. The estate was in Medina, on the eastern shore of Lake Washington. She drove herself. The directions from the address led her through a neighborhood of established trees and long driveways until she reached a gate that was unlocked. Someone had unlocked it for her, presumably Marcos, and then up a gravel drive through a stand of Douglas firs that opened onto a house she hadn't expected. It was not the Wycliffe mansion she had unconsciously imagined. It was large but human-scaled, built in the craftsman tradition, with wide eaves and deep porches, the kind of house that looked like it had grown into its surroundings over time, rather than been placed in them. It was showing its age. In places the paint on the window trim needed work. One section of porch railing was newer than the rest, but it was not neglected. Someone had been keeping it. A man in his 60s came around the side of the house when she parked. He was compact and weathered, with the hands of someone who worked outdoors in all seasons and had stopped noticing the weather a long time ago. "Ms. Bellrose," he said, "I'm Marcos. I've been the caretaker here for 18 years. He looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated appraisal of someone who has no stake in the social dynamics of the situations and is simply registering what he sees. "He told me you'd come someday. I'm glad it's today." "Why today?" He looked past her toward the side of the house. "The quince is starting." She didn't know what that meant yet. He walked her around the side of the house and she followed him, and then she stopped. The garden covered approximately half an acre behind the house, running down toward a view of the lake that opened up between the trees. It was not a formal garden, not the kind of structured, geometric arrangement that wealthy estates typically maintained. It was dense and layered, and slightly wild at the edges, full of the kind of planting that took decades to develop into itself. There were trees she couldn't identify, heavy and established, with the thick bark of serious age. There were beds of something dormant that she recognized vaguely as roses. There were climbing things on low trellises and ground cover she couldn't name, and in the near corner, a tree she would learn was a quince, bare-branched, but showing along each branch the tight-furred buds that in another few weeks would open pink and fragrant and brief. She stood at the edge of it. Augustus Wycliffe had started this garden 20 years ago. She had been 12 years old. She had been growing up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Atlanta with her mother, who worked 2 jobs and still made dinner on Sundays, and never once suggested to her daughter that the world owed her anything, but that she could take what was hers if she was willing to work for it. While she was doing that, her father had been here, planting things, coming back to tend them, choosing over and over across 20 years to return to this specific ground rather than walk away from it. She walked into the garden. Marcos didn't follow. He understood, apparently, that this was not a guided tour. She walked slowly, aware of her own footsteps on the winter-soft ground, aware of the cold that was different here than in the city, damper, earthier, full of the mineral smell of things that were dormant rather than dead. She walked the length of the garden and back, and then she stopped near the quince tree and stood with her hands in her coat pockets and looked at it. She was not going to cry. She had cried once in this whole sequence of events in the OR when Amaras screamed, and that had been a physical reaction to the release of a specific terror, not an emotional performance. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she did not cry now. But she stood at the quince tree for a long time. She stood there long enough that the cold moved through her coat, and she had to shift her weight from foot to foot. She stood there long enough that the light changed from the flat gray of morning to the slightly warmer, flat gray of midday. She stood there long enough to feel the specific, unglamorous, complicated weight of a relationship that had existed, entirely on one side, a father who had watched and planted and stayed away, and a daughter who had not known he was there to miss. She thought about what it would have meant to know him. She let herself think about that fully, without the protective distance of analysis, the dinners, the conversations, the accumulation of ordinary shared time that was the actual substance of a relationship. Not the grand gestures, but the small, consistent returns. She let herself feel the loss of all of that. She felt it. Then she let it settle into the place where things go, that are true and painful and unchangeable, the interior room that everyone carries and that doesn't shrink with time, but does, eventually, stop being the only room you're in. She took out her phone and called Vivienne. Vivienne picked up on the second ring. "I'm at the estate," Imani said, "the garden." A pause. "Have you been here?" "Not since Augustus died," Vivienne said. Her voice was careful, feeling out the quality of the conversation. "He used to bring me here when I was small, before Sterling took over managing everything. A beat. I've thought about going back. I didn't know if it was—" "Come," Imani said. "Whenever you want. It's part of the settlement." She looked at the quince buds. "It belongs to all 3 of us now." Vivienne was quiet for a moment. The silence had a texture to it, something loosening, carefully in stages. "I'd like that," she said. After she hung up, Imani stood in the garden for another few minutes. Then she walked back toward the house. and Marcos was on the porch with 2 cups of coffee, and she sat on the drank the coffee and listened to him talk about the garden, what was planted where, what was coming in spring, what Augustus had changed and added and returned to over the years. She listened carefully, the way she listened to everything that mattered, and she memorized enough to come back, knowing what she was looking at. The board meeting was 6 weeks after the signing. Imani arrived at Wycliffe Crown Holdings corporate headquarters at 8:45. The building was in South Lake Union glass and steel, the particular architecture of institutional convents, the kind that announces without words that the organization inside has been here for decades and intends to continue. She had been here once before, years ago, for a conference that had nothing to do with the Wycliffe Empire, and she had walked through the lobby without giving the company name above the door a second look. She gave it a second look now. The boardroom was on the 32nd floor with a view of the lake and the garden district, and on a clear day, the mountains. It was not a clear day. It was a typical Seattle morning low cloud, gray light, the kind of weather that made everything look both beautiful and provisional. There were 11 board members. She recognized none of them personally, though she had read all of their biographical materials and their voting histories and the positions they had taken on the last 4 major decisions the board had made. She had done this the way she did all research comprehensively and without asking anyone for a summary, because summaries reflected the priorities of the person who made them, and she was interested in her own read. Sterling was at the table. He was at the far end, in the chair that would have been the head of the table when he ran meetings here alone, which was no longer the head, or rather, it was one of 2. The chair at the opposite end was where she sat. He looked at her when she sat down. She looked at him. They had not spoken since the signing. The communication had been through attorneys, then through corporate administration, as the transfer was processed. This was the first time they had been in the same room since that conference table with the notary and the 43 pages. He nodded. She nodded. It was not warmth. It was not even comfort. It was the specific, functional acknowledgement of 2 people who have decided that the war is over, and that what replaces it is not friendship but something more durable and more honest than hostility, a working arrangement built on the understanding that they are permanently connected now, that the connection was not their choice but its management is, and that the quality of that management will determine what the next decades of this institution look like. The meeting ran 2 hours. She spoke 5 times. Each time she spoke, she had something specific to say. She did not speak to establish presence or to signal that she was paying attention. She spoke when she had a substantive contribution to make to what was actually being discussed, and she was concise about it, and she could see in the way the attention in the room calibrated that this registered correctly. The 5th time she spoke was about the policy. She had drafted it with Conrad and a healthcare attorney she had hired separately, and she presented it in 7 minutes, the provision, the portion that in 7 no patient at any Wycliffe Crown facility could have emergency treatment delayed or denied due to an insurance dispute if they were presenting in a documented medical emergency. The implementation framework, the cost model, the liability protections for the hospitals. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. One of the board members, a woman in her 60s, the longest-serving member, a physician herself who had joined the board when Augustus was still actively running the company, said, "This is the right thing to do. We should have done it years ago." The motion passed 8-3. Sterling voted yes. She noted this. She did not know what it meant yet, whether it was a genuine shift to strategic repositioning or simply a man who understood that the room had changed and was adjusting. She filed it without concluding anything about it. It's because people were more than their worst moments, and she was not going to define Sterling Wycliffe by his worst moments, any more than she wanted to be defined by the 2 weeks she had spent 11 days post-surgery rebuilding. Her entire world from the hospital lobby floor up. Tae-jun came to see her that evening. Not with a plan, not with information. He came with dinner from a restaurant she had mentioned once, months ago, that she'd been meaning to try, and he stood in her doorway with the bag and said, "I heard the policy passed." It did. She stepped back to let him in. Amara was in the living room in the baby chair that played music, in the specific trance state of a 6-week-old encountering a mobile. Diane was in the kitchen, and the sound of her, there the familiar domestic sound of a mother in a kitchen, was something Imani had not realized she needed until she heard it every evening, and felt the particular relief of it. Tae-jun set the dinner on the counter and looked at Amara for a moment. "May I?" he said.
Yeah.
Yes. He picked her up with the careful, slightly formal precision of a man who did not do this often and was aware of that fact and compensating for it with attention. Amara looked at him with the flat, evaluating stare of a very young infant encountering a new face, the expression that contained neither welcome nor rejection, but pure, unfiltered assessment. "She's skeptical," Imani said. "That's fair." He held her with both hands, supporting her head, keeping her level. "She doesn't know me." "No." He looked at her, at the baby, not at Imani. "Can I come back regularly?" He said it without performing casualness, no strategic lightness, no hedging. Just the question, direct. "I want her to know me." "I understand that's not automatic. I understand it requires showing up consistently over time." He looked up at Imani. "I'm willing to do that." "I know you are," she said. "Is that a yes? It's not a no." She took Amara from him. The baby had it's making the sounds that meant she was about 30 seconds from deciding she was hungry, and settled her against her shoulder. "It's a let's see. Which is the honest answer?" He nodded. "Tae-jun." She looked at him. "The syndicate. I've started the process." He said it simply, without drama. "It's going to take time. There are people who need legitimate alternatives before I can close down the operations they've depended on. Relationships that need to be restructured rather than just severed." He met her eyes. "But I've started. I'm not asking you to account to me for it." "I know. I'm telling you because you asked me, weeks ago, to stop making decisions without telling you." A pause. "This is me telling you." She looked at him, at the face she had loved at 29 and spent 3 years learning to stop missing, and then spent 3 more weeks finding under everything he'd withheld, and it was still under all of that. Under the things he'd done wrong, and the things he'd done right, and the years of careful management that had finally cracked open. Under pressure, it was still the face she knew better than almost any other. "Stay for dinner," she said. He stayed. Spring came incrementally the way it always did, in Seattle, not with warmth, exactly, but with light. More of it, arriving earlier, lasting later, the kind of incremental change you didn't notice day to day, but that accumulated across weeks into something undeniable. On a Saturday in April, Imani drove to the Medina estate. She had been 4 times now. Marcos had started leaving the gate unlocked on weekend, asked, the unspoken assumption of someone who has recognized a pattern of return and adjusted to it. Each time she had come to the garden and walked it, and sometimes talked to Marcos, and sometimes just stood in whatever was growing. Today she brought Amara. She carried her in the carrier against her chest. Amara was 11 weeks old and regarded the world from the carrier with the imperious attention of a person who has figured out that height and proximity are both advantageous. She looked at the trees. She looked at the sky. She made a sound that might have been commentary. Vivian was already there. She had driven up from her apartment in Capitol Hill, and she was standing at the quince tree, which had bloomed and was now past peak. The flowers had opened in mid-March and last 3 weeks, and now the petals were down and the tree was leafing into the more ordinary green of its summer phase. She was looking at it with her coat collar up against the April wind, and she turned when she heard footsteps on the gravel. She looked at Amara. Amara looked at her. "She's enormous," Vivian said. "She's 12 pounds. She looks enormous. She looks like she's already planning something." "She's always planning something." Imani stopped beside her at the quince tree. They stood together for a moment, looking at the tree with its new leaves, the faint, remaining pink of a few late petals in the high branches. "Sterling called me," Vivian said. Imani waited. He didn't say what he wanted. He said he wanted to talk. Vivian turned her coat collar up slightly higher. "I haven't called him back yet. What are you going to do?" "I don't know." She looked at the tree. "He's my brother. He's also the person who spent a year trying to erase our sister." She said our sister without hesitation, without the slight self-consciousness it had carried in her voice in earlier conversations. It had become ordinary in the way that true things do when you say them enough times. I don't know how to hold both of those things. You don't have to hold them at the same time, Imani said. You can handle one and then the other. Which one first? That's yours to decide. Vivienne nodded slowly. She reached up and touched one of the new leaves on the quince tree lightly, a brief contact, like checking whether it was real. He came here, she said. Last week, he didn't tell me. Marcos told me. He came and walked the garden and left before Marcos could talk to him. She paused. He put fresh flowers at the base of the old oak. That was Augustus's. She stopped. That was where Augustus liked to sit. Imani thought about Sterling at the signing, handing her the envelope. I almost didn't bring it today. The man who had voted yes on the patient care policy without explanation. The man who had come alone to a garden he probably hadn't visited since his father died and placed flowers at the tree where his father used to sit. She did not know what to do with Sterling Wycliffe. She was not sure she would ever know fully, and she had begun to accept that not knowing was also a legitimate place to stand. Call him back, she said finally, not because he deserves it. Because you deserved to not be carrying that unanswered call. Vivienne was quiet for a moment. Then, they walked the rest of the garden, together, the three of them, Vivienne and Imani and Amara in the carrier, moving through the April green of the estate garden, while Marcos worked at the far end doing something Imani didn't have the vocabulary for yet, but was starting to learn. She was learning the names of things. Slowly, the way you learn anything that requires patience by returning to it, asking questions, letting the knowledge accumulate in the specific, unspectacular way that real knowledge always did. Tae-jun came to the garden for the first time in early May. She hadn't planned it that way. She had mentioned the week before that she would be at the estate on Saturday, and he had said nothing. And then on Saturday he had texted at 10:30 to say he was nearby and asked if the offer was still open. She had said yes. He arrived in the same charcoal overcoat. She suspected he owned several. She suspected they were all identical, and he walked through the gate and looked at the estate house, and then at the garden, and stood at the entrance to it for a long moment before he came in. She was near the quince tree, which was fully leafed now, ordinary and satisfied looking in its post-blooms state. Amarca was in the pram that Marcos had somehow acquired. She didn't ask how. She'd stopped asking how Marcos produced practical solutions for things she hadn't mentioned needing and was asleep. Tae-jun came and stood beside her. He looked at the garden for a long time, without speaking, and she let him, because this was something she understood about him. Now, he needed time with things before he spoke about them, and this was not evasion, but the way he processed, and it was not her job to manage his processing speed. He built this for you, Tae-jun said finally. He built it because he needed to build something, she said. I'm choosing to inherit it. He looked at her. Those aren't the same thing, he said. No, she agreed, they're not. A silence. Not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that has been earned by enough hard conversation that it no longer needs to be filled. I'm being deposed next month, he said. The federal process. Voluntary cooperation. Full disclosure. My attorneys estimate it takes 6 to 8 months to complete. And after the legitimate businesses continue. The other operations, he paused. By the time the process is complete, most of them will already be wound down. He looked at the garden. It's not clean. None of it is going to be clean. I know. Some people I've managed relationships with for 20 years are going to have to find different arrangements. Some of those arrangements are going to be worse than what I provided. His voice was flat, not self-exculpatory, just honest about the complexity. I can't solve that. I can only stop making it my business to manage it. She looked at her daughter, asleep in the pram with the April sun on her face. Are you afraid? She said. He considered this seriously, which she appreciated. He didn't deflect it or masculinize it. Yes, he said. Not of the legal process, of what's on the other side of it. I've been the person who runs things for 30 years. I don't know who I am without that. You're figuring it out, she said. Slowly. That's the only speed it happens at. He looked at her. The lines around his eyes had deepened in the months since the hospital, the specific weathering that came from sustained stress and insufficient sleep, and the particular kind of reckoning that required you to dismantle something you had spent decades building. He looked like someone who was in the middle of becoming something, not comfortably arrived at anything. She knew the feeling. She extended her hand, not dramatically, not with any weight of symbolism she was trying to construct in the moment. Just her hand open, in the space between them. He looked at it. Then he took it, not with the grip of a man reclaiming something, with the grip of someone who understood, finally, that holding on and possessing were not the same action, and that the difference between them was the entire question. They stood like that for a while. The garden moved around them in the May wind, the old trees shifting overhead, the things that had been planted 20 years ago and had grown into something nobody could have predicted exactly, because that was the nature of growing things. That you planted toward an intention, and what arrived was always itself, always a negotiation between what you hoped for and what the ground was actually capable of producing. Amara slept. The quince tree, past its blooming now, made no particular statement. It was simply present, which was its own kind of statement. Imani looked at the garden, at the beds and the trees and the climbing things on their trellises and the ground cover spreading in the low places, and she thought about Augustus in this same space, across 20 years of Saturdays. Returning to 10-something, he could not be honest about, but also could not abandon. Saint-Oncine. She thought about the failure and the faithfulness existing in person simultaneously, the way they always did, because people were not either their failures or their faithfulness, but the whole uncomfortable combination. And making peace with that in a parent, in a lover, in a half-brother who had voted yes on a policy she authored, and then gone alone to put flowers at his dead father's tree, was the actual work. Not the legal work, not the financial work, not even the emotional work in the acute sense. The ongoing, unspectacular, years-long work of deciding to keep showing up to ground that had hurt you and learning, gradually, what it was capable of growing. She did not forgive Augustus that afternoon. Forgiveness, she was beginning to understand, was not a decision you made once. It was a direction you kept choosing, imperfectly, over time. And some days you were oriented toward it, and some days you were not, and the important thing was the returning. She would return. She already knew that about herself. Imani Bellrose, 32 years old, board member of Wycliffe Crown Holdings, mother of Amara, daughter of Diane and Augustus, half-sister of Sterling and Vivienne. Whatever she was, and was still becoming with the man whose hand she was holding, she stood in her father's garden in the May light. And she was not healed, she was not resolved. She was not at peace in the way that stories sometimes suggested was the destination. She was present. She was standing on ground that belonged to her. She was tending it. That was enough. That was in the end, the whole of it, not the inheritance, not the battle won, not the policy or the settlement signed, or the ruling handed down in a courthouse with fluorescent lights and institutional carpeting. Those things were real, and they mattered, and they had cost what they cost. But the thing underneath all of them, the thing that had been true before any of it began, and after all of it settled, was simpler and harder and more durable than any of it. No one would ever again decide who Imani Bellrose was allowed to become. She had decided that herself. She was deciding it still.